Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories, where curiosity gets cosy and the ancient world takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight's gentle journey is all about a face in the desert, a body cut from stone, and a mystery that has refused to sit quietly for decades. We're going to spend some time with the Great Sphinx of Giza, that enormous and familiar monument that almost everyone recognises, even if they have never stood before it in person. It has appeared in books, documentaries, school lessons, postcards, conspiracy theories, airport gift shops, and probably a surprising number of refrigerator magnets. And yet, for all that fame, one of the biggest questions about it is still not settled. Why does the rock around the Sphinx look the way it does? Was it shaped mostly by wind and sand, as many scholars argue, or is there evidence of ancient rainfall weathering the stone, hinting at a far older past than the standard timeline allows? Before we settle into that mystery, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Maybe it is late at night and the room is quiet. Maybe it is early morning and the world has not fully started asking things of you yet. Maybe you're listening with a lamp on, a blanket pulled up, and exactly 1 foot sticking out for temperature regulation, which is a deeply human system and probably as old as civilization. However you arrived here, I am glad you did. If you find this soothing, interesting, or simply a pleasant way to unwind after a long day, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed. It helps this calm little corner reach more people who enjoy drifting off with ancient mysteries and old stones that refuse to explain themselves. And this one really does refuse. The Sphinx has been sitting there for a very long time doing what old monuments do best, which is looking important, remaining silent, and encouraging generations of humans to argue about it with great confidence. Now, I do hope this is relaxing enough to carry you gently towards sleep. But if it keeps you awake for a little while, at least you'll be awake in the company of one of the strangest debates in Egyptology and geology. So settle in, unclench your shoulders, let the day move a little farther away and let's begin. Because somewhere between the limestone of Giza, the vanished rains of ancient North Africa, and the sharp confidence of modern experts lies the story of the Sphinx water erosion mystery. The Great Sphinx is one of those monuments that feels oddly familiar even before you learn anything about it. It belongs to that small group of ancient creations that seem to live in the modern imagination all by themselves. The pyramids do this. Stonehenge does this. The Moai on Easter Island do it too. You see them once and they settle into your mind as symbols, almost more like ideas than objects. The Sphinx especially carries that effect. A human head, a lion's body, immense scale, damaged face, broken nose, patient expression, desert setting. It is at once specific and dreamlike. It looks like something built on purpose and remembered imperfectly. For many people, that is where the story begins and ends. There is a giant statue in Egypt. It is old. It is mysterious. It is next to the pyramids. The end. But once you stay with it a little longer, the easy familiarity starts to fall apart. The Sphinx is not simply sitting on the Giza plateau as a separate block brought in from elsewhere. It was carved directly from the bedrock. The body and the surrounding enclosure are part of the same geological story. That matters more than it might seem at first. It means that the monument is not just sculpture, it is also excavation. To create the Sphinx, ancient workers did not only shape a creature from stone, they cut away the stone around it. What remains is both statue and negative space, body and trench, monument and wound in the plateau. And this is where the argument begins to sharpen. Because when observers study the enclosure walls around the Sphinx and parts of the body itself, they see weathering patterns that have inspired an extraordinary dispute. Some say the erosion looks like the result of prolonged exposure to heavy rainfall. Others say that conclusion goes too far, that the patterns can be explained through a combination of wind, salt, moisture, differences in stone quality, and the long, complicated life of limestone under desert conditions. At first glance, that may sound like a disagreement over rock texture, which is not always the easiest way to thrill a room. But the implications are enormous. If rainfall shaped those surfaces in the way some geologists propose, then the major erosion could point to a time when the climate of the region was much wetter than it was during the age traditionally assigned to the Sphinx. And if that were true, the monument, or at least the core carving of it, might be far older than the standard Old Kingdom dating linked to Pharaoh Khafre around the 4th dynasty. That is the kind of suggestion that makes some people lean in and others fold their arms immediately. The mainstream view, which remains the dominant academic position, places the Sphinx in the Old Kingdom, most commonly in the reign of Khafre, around 2500 BCE. This dating does not rest on one magical inscription saying, Khafre made this, signed and dated, because ancient monuments are rarely that cooperative. Instead, it comes from context, archaeology, associated structures, stylistic comparisons, and the relationship of the Sphinx to the broader Giza complex. The temple architecture nearby, the arrangement of causeways, the quarrying patterns, and the historical understanding of the pyramid builders all feed into that interpretation. For many Egyptologists, the matter is not mysterious at all. The Sphinx belongs to Khafre's building program. It is weathered because ancient limestone weathers. End of discussion. Except it has not been the end of discussion, not even close. Because every so often someone stands before the Sphinx enclosure, looks at the channels and rounded surfaces in the rock and says in effect, that does not look like sand to me. And when that person happens to be trained in geology rather than Egyptology, the debate becomes harder to wave away as mere romantic speculation. That is part of what made the water erosion question so persistent. It did not arrive only from fringe storytellers hoping to attach Atlantis, lost civilizations, or prehistory in capital letters to every famous stone on Earth. It also emerged from direct geological observation, or at least from claims of direct geological observation, and that gave it a different sort of weight. Not accepted weight everywhere, but enough to keep the argument alive. There is something almost irresistible about that kind of mystery. We like old stones already. We like deserts. We like monuments with damaged faces. Add the possibility that a monument may be older than history says, and the human brain begins behaving like a cat that has spotted movement under the sofa. It becomes difficult to look away. Suddenly every crack feels significant. Every groove becomes a clue. Every silence in the historical record starts sounding dramatic. This is where people can get carried away, of course. Ancient mysteries have a habit of attracting certainty from all directions. One side says everything is settled, the other says everything is hidden. In between, the actual stone just sits there, continuing to be limestone, which is not nearly as dramatic as human debate but generally more reliable. Still, it is worth appreciating how unusual the Sphinx is before the argument even begins. It is not a clean, intact statue preserved in ideal form. It has endured damage, restoration, burial, exposure, and reburial over very long stretches of time. Sand covered large parts of it for centuries on end. Different periods attempted repairs, blocks were added, surfaces were patched. Entire generations looked at a monument already ancient to them and tried to keep it from falling apart. So when we speak about what the Sphinx shows, we are never speaking about a perfect original condition. We are looking at a monument with a biography, and biographies complicate evidence. That complication is part of why this mystery has lasted. The more you examine it, the less it behaves like a simple argument between smart people and confused people. Instead, it becomes a case study in how different fields look at the same object. Egyptologists ask questions about dynasties, iconography, building programs, inscriptions, and archaeological context. Geologists ask questions about stratification, weathering, runoff, fracture patterns, and erosional processes. Both are looking at the same monument, but they are not always trained to see the same problems first. Sometimes that leads to productive cooperation. Sometimes it leads to two experts standing several feet apart, politely disagreeing with the sort of facial expressions that suggest they would prefer several miles. And then there is the wider audience, which includes all the rest of us, hovering somewhere between fascination and confusion. We hear phrases like vertical erosion, precipitation weathering, aeolian processes, and Old Kingdom attribution, and we do our best to keep up while quietly hoping someone will explain it in ordinary language. That is exactly what we're going to do. We are not going to rush. There is no need. Ancient stone has waited this long. It can spare us a calm evening. So let us start with the basic image. Imagine the Sphinx not as a postcard or drone shot, but as a carved figure lying within a cut enclosure on the Giza plateau. It is massive, low, weathered, and inseparable from the surrounding stone. The body extends out from the mother rock with the head rising above it. The enclosure walls around it show heavy erosion. In some places the rock appears rounded and deeply worn, not simply sharp-edged and sandblasted. To certain observers, that rounded weathering suggests water moving over exposed surfaces for long periods. Not one brief storm, not the occasional shower, but significant rainfall in a climate capable of producing repeated saturation and runoff. That idea immediately creates a timeline problem. The Giza plateau today is desert. It has been dry for a very long time. Old Kingdom Egypt, while not identical to the modern Sahara, was not a lush rain-soaked landscape. So if the erosion really requires much heavier rainfall, then one must look to an earlier climatic phase, a period when North Africa was substantially wetter than it later became. That pushes the conversation far back, possibly into the late Pleistocene or early Holocene, depending on how the argument is framed. And once that happens, the question is no longer just about erosion. It becomes a question about civilization, chronology, and what kind of people, if any, could have carved something so monumental in such a remote era. You can see why emotions enter the room quickly. For some, the water erosion hypothesis feels exciting because it opens the door to lost chapters of human history. For others, it feels reckless because it leaps from geology to civilization with too little evidence in between. Those are not trivial concerns. A monument can be older in one aspect and later in another. A site can be reworked. A natural formation can be modified. A carved monument can be restored so heavily that the surviving evidence becomes a layered puzzle. There are many ways for old stone to produce new arguments. The Sphinx has had plenty of time to do exactly that. There is ancient evidence that it was already being restored in pharaonic times. Later generations dug it out of the sand. Still later visitors described it, sketched it, speculated about it, and attached meanings of their own. By the modern era, it had become not just an ancient monument, but a stage for competing ideas about Egypt itself. Was Egypt the product of a brilliant but historically grounded civilization whose achievements, while impressive, remain within the known human story? Or was it a surviving fragment of something older, stranger, and partly forgotten? The Sphinx, perhaps more than any other monument at Giza, sits right on that fault line. Part of its power comes from its face. Even damaged, it still suggests intention. It still appears to be watching. Humans are especially vulnerable to faces. A cracked wall can be ignored. A giant weathered face in a desert cannot. We automatically assume expression, personality, mood, knowledge. We say it looks calm, stern, wise, wounded, distant. We act as though it is holding something back. This is not science, of course. It is psychology. But psychology matters because it shapes the way mysteries take hold. The Sphinx does not merely exist. It performs silence in a way that invites interpretation. And then there is the setting. Giza is not an anonymous archaeological field. It is one of the most symbolically loaded landscapes on Earth. Pyramids rise nearby with their own endless cargo of theories, from careful engineering histories to extravagant fantasies involving ancient machines, cosmic alignments, hidden chambers, and civilizations that somehow had marvelous knowledge but left very inconveniently little paperwork. The Sphinx lives in that neighbourhood. It cannot avoid being drawn into the same gravity field of speculation. Even a modest geological question begins attracting grand historical conclusions almost immediately. Yet the central issue is surprisingly concrete. Look at the stone. What kind of weathering made those forms? How long would that process take? Under what conditions could it happen? Does the erosion predate the carving of the Sphinx as we know it, happen during its early life, or accumulate through later exposure and restoration cycles? These are hard questions, but they are not meaningless ones. They are exactly the kind of questions that can sometimes move a mystery from dramatic music into sober investigation. What makes this especially interesting is that both sides believe they are defending reason. Those who support the conventional dating often see themselves as protecting archaeology from overreach, keeping interpretation tied to context and material evidence rather than seductive leaps. Those who support the rain erosion idea often see themselves as resisting institutional inertia, insisting that the stone itself must be allowed to speak even when it says something inconvenient. Each side thinks the other is missing something obvious. That is often the sign of a real intellectual fight rather than a simple misunderstanding. And perhaps that is why the Sphinx water erosion mystery still matters. Not because it has already overturned history, and not because it has been neatly dismissed, but because it lives in that uncomfortable space where evidence, expertise, ego, and imagination all meet. It reminds us that ancient monuments are not only relics, they are arguments in stone. They continue to test the stories we build around them. So tonight we are going to walk slowly into that argument. We will look at what the water erosion claim actually says, why it gained attention, what the mainstream answer is, and why the disagreement has not dried up and blown away despite years of debate. We will spend time with climate, limestone, rainfall, desert weathering, dynastic Egypt, and the persistent human habit of looking at old mysteries and immediately trying either to explain them completely or turn them into a cosmic secret. As usual, the truth may be less flashy than the wildest theories and more interesting than the simplest ones. For now, it is enough to hold the image in mind. A colossal figure carved from the living rock of Giza. A monument partly buried for centuries, partly restored, always weathering. Walls around it marked by deep grooves and rounded surfaces. A desert that was not always a desert. Scholars disagreeing in books, articles and documentaries. Visitors standing before the enclosure and feeling, almost instantly, that something about it is unfinished in our understanding. Not unfinished in stone, but unfinished in explanation. And that is where we continue. Because once the Sphinx stops being just a famous monument and starts becoming a geological question, the enclosure walls begin to matter as much as the face, and the marks in the stone begin telling a story that may be older, more ordinary, or more surprising than anyone wanted them to be. If you picture the Sphinx right now, there is a good chance you're not picturing the real monument so much as the edited version that lives in everybody's head. Most of us carry around a sort of mental postcard, a giant stone face in Egypt, pyramids behind it, desert all around, maybe a dramatic sunset which ancient monuments in documentaries seem contractually obligated to receive. The image is so familiar that it can feel almost too familiar, as if we already understand the place before we have really looked at it. That is part of what makes the Sphinx so interesting. It is famous enough to feel known and strange enough to remain unknown at the same time. The odd thing is that people who have never studied Egypt at all can identify it instantly. That says a lot about its cultural power. There are very few ancient monuments that have become shorthand for mystery itself. The Sphinx has managed this so thoroughly that it is no longer just one monument among others. It is a symbol for hidden knowledge, buried history, forgotten ages, tourist photos where someone pretends to boop the nose that no longer exists, and the general human conviction that very old stone must be up to something. But the actual monument, the one sitting on the Giza plateau, is less tidy than the version in the mind. It is not simply a giant statue standing cleanly on open ground. It is carved from bedrock. It lies in a cut enclosure. Its proportions are unusual. Its head appears comparatively small against the long body, which is one reason people have long wondered whether it may have been reworked at some point. Its face is damaged. Its body has needed repeated repair. Parts of it have spent long stretches buried in sand. Other parts have been exposed and weathered. It has not lived a calm or static life. It has been carved, eroded, restored, buried, uncovered, admired, measured, argued over, photographed and interpreted by people separated by thousands of years. That is why it helps to slow down and meet the Sphinx as a physical thing rather than an icon. It sits on the Giza plateau west of modern Cairo, near the Great Pyramids. It is usually described as having the body of a lion and the head of a human, likely representing royal power joined to strength and control. The body stretches out low to the ground. The paws extend forward. The face rises above the long horizontal form, which gives it that distinctive profile, part ruler, part beast, part geological event. Because that is really what it is. It is art and stone cutting and landscape modification all at once. The first surprise for many people is scale. The Sphinx is huge, though in photographs it can sometimes look smaller than it really is because the plateau around it is also huge, and because the pyramids nearby are so visually overwhelming that almost everything else risks becoming a supporting actor. In reality, the Sphinx is around 73 metres long and about 20 metres high. You do not really grasp that from a postcard. You grasp it when you imagine workers cutting around a massive limestone and shaping an enormous creature from the living rock itself. That changes the feeling of it. It becomes less like a statue that was put somewhere, and more like a piece of the plateau persuaded with great effort to become a monument. And that word persuaded is probably too gentle, because the process would have involved a great deal of labour and organisation. Ancient workers had to cut trenches around the body, remove vast quantities of stone, shape the remaining mass, and then manage whatever structural problems the stone itself presented. The geology mattered from the beginning. The limestone layers at Giza are not all identical. Some are stronger, some weaker, some more resistant to weathering than others. That matters because when you carve a monument directly from bedrock, you're not working with a perfect block of uniform material. You're working with what the plateau gives you. The monument already contains the strengths and weaknesses of its geology before the first chisel lands. This helps explain something about the Sphinx that people sometimes find unsettling when they see it closely. It is not smooth in the way modern people often expect monuments to be smooth. Its body is uneven. The surface has suffered. Repair blocks have been added in various places. Some areas look rough, worn and patched. The monument does not feel polished and complete. It feels old in a more complicated sense. It feels like something that has survived rather than something that has simply remained. That sense of survival becomes even clearer when you remember how often the Sphinx was buried. Sand is one of the quiet main characters in its history. It is easy to think of the desert as just background, but in the life of the Sphinx, the sand has been active. It has drifted, accumulated, swallowed, exposed and reshaped the conditions of preservation. For long periods, much of the monument was covered. Ancient Egyptians themselves dealt with a Sphinx that could disappear into the sand more than a modern visitor might assume. Later, rulers and restorers dug it out again. Roman period visitors saw it under different conditions than medieval travellers. 19th and 20th century excavators encountered a monument already altered by centuries of exposure and concealment. This is one reason why the Sphinx is so easy to oversimplify. People say, it has been there for thousands of years, which is true, but what that usually suggests in the imagination is a monument sitting unchanged, under an open sky for all that time. That is not what happened. The Sphinx has had phases. It has had seasons of visibility and invisibility. It has had periods of damage and repair. Its enclosure has filled and emptied. its stone has reacted to burial differently than it has reacted to exposure. If you want to understand the monument, you have to understand that you are not looking at a frozen moment from the past. You're looking at the result of a long and messy history. And still, despite all that complexity, the monument remains oddly approachable. Perhaps that is because it is built around a face. Human beings are very forgiving toward complexity if a face is involved. We're designed to notice faces, assign them moods, and assume they are looking back. The Sphinx face, even damaged, gives the monument a personality that other ruins lack. You do not just see limestone, you see expression, or rather you think you do. Some people call it calm, some call it stern, some think it looks detached, others wise, others a little tired, which is fair enough after several thousand years of weather, sand, restoration, and tourists discussing you at full volume from a respectful but not especially quiet distance. The missing nose naturally draws attention too, because humans are also deeply distracted by damage to faces. That absence creates drama. Many people grow up hearing one or another confident explanation for the missing nose, often involving Napoleon, because history apparently cannot be introduced to a famous monument without somebody blaming Napoleon. But the damage is older than that. The point here is not just the missing feature itself, it is the way damage changes how the monument is received. The face becomes more enigmatic because it is incomplete. If it were perfectly preserved, it would still be impressive, but it might feel less like a witness from another age, and more like a clear statement from a known past. Damage creates uncertainty. Uncertainty invites imagination. The surrounding setting does the rest. The Sphinx does not stand alone on an empty plain. It belongs to the Giza complex, and that changes everything. Nearby rise the pyramids, among the most famous structures on Earth. Their sheer presence influences how the Sphinx is perceived. If the same monument were found in a less famous place, it would still be remarkable, but it might not carry the same burden of expectation. At Giza, every stone is forced into a larger conversation about dynasties, kingship, religion, engineering, lost knowledge, and the persistent modern urge to decide that if something is impressive, it must either be fully explained or secretly impossible. The Sphinx sits right in the middle of that tension. On one level, it fits comfortably within ancient Egyptian patterns of royal symbolism. Lions were associated with strength, guardianship, and power. Human-headed lions could serve as royal images, joining physical dominance with intelligence and authority. The monument is often connected with Khafre, the builder of the second pyramid at Giza, because of archaeological context and the relationship of nearby structures. That is the standard explanation. It does not require aliens, Atlanteans, vanished super-civilizations, or any other emergency measures. It says in effect that an old kingdom ruler commissioned a massive symbolic monument as part of a royal complex, and that over time it weathered, was buried, and needed restoration. That explanation is possible, reasonable, and accepted by most scholars. But even if you accept it completely, the Sphinx still resists becoming ordinary. There is something about the monument that keeps pulling people into closer inspection. Part of that is the body itself. If you look beyond the familiar head, the rest of the monument is less elegant than people often expect. The body is elongated and lower than the grand face might lead you to imagine. The proportions can feel slightly awkward. The paws are large, the back low, the tail wrapped along one side. The bedrock layers show through in ways that remind you this was not sculpted from imported stone by a workshop with unlimited material. It was wrestled out of the plateau and then forced to make the best of the plateau's own imperfections. There is something almost refreshing about that. Great monuments are often cleaned up in popular memory. They become ideal forms. The real Sphinx is not ideal in that way. It is magnificent and battered at once. It has authority, but it also has scars. And once you notice that, you begin to notice the enclosure too. This is where casual familiarity starts giving way to actual study. The Sphinx is not just the figure, it is the cut space surrounding the figure. The walls around it matter, the floor matters. The relationship between carved body and surrounding trench matters. If you only look at the face, you're seeing the monument the way modern symbolism likes to see it. If you look at the enclosure, you are seeing the monument the way geology and archaeology force you to see it. That enclosure is one of the key reasons the Sphinx remains so heavily debated. The walls around it display patterns of wear that do not look trivial. Even to a non-specialist, they can appear dramatic. There are grooves, rounded profiles and surfaces that seem deeply weathered. Now, a non-specialist should always be careful here, because rock can mislead the eye. Things that look obvious often turn out to be complicated. But it is completely understandable that people see these features and think that looks important. It is important. The only question is what exactly it means. Before we get to the argument over erosion, it helps simply to stay with the visual experience of the place. Imagine approaching the Sphinx not from the perspective of a film montage, but as a visitor trying to make sense of the monument as a whole. You see the head first because that is what the world has trained you to see. Then the scale begins to register, then the body, then the enclosure. Then, if you keep looking, the stone itself begins to take over the conversation. The monument becomes less about a face in the desert and more about carved limestone under a long history of environmental stress. This shift from symbol to object is essential. Famous monuments suffer from symbolic overload. Everyone already knows what they represent before looking at what they're made of. The Sphinx has been assigned so many meanings that it is easy to forget its most basic reality. It is a carved mass of stratified limestone on a plateau that has changed over time. It has been exposed to sun, sand, moisture, salt, wind, and repair campaigns. It has been shaped by human intention and by natural processes acting over centuries and millennia. Any serious question about it has to begin there, with material reality rather than romance. At the same time, romance is part of why people keep returning to it. The Sphinx is old enough to make ordinary certainty wobble. There is no one standing nearby with a signed construction log, no neat sequence of unbroken written records explaining every stage of its making, damage, burial, and restoration. Ancient Egypt left a great deal behind, but like every ancient civilization, it left gaps. Into those gaps pours interpretation, sometimes careful, sometimes wild, often entertaining. The Sphinx attracts more than its fair share because it seems to invite that kind of thinking. It looks like a monument built to ask a question rather than answer one. Even ancient Egyptians treated it as something worthy of renewed attention. By the New Kingdom, the Sphinx was already an ancient monument. That fact alone is worth pausing over. There were people living in pharaonic Egypt for whom the Sphinx was already a relic from a distant past. They did not encounter it as a new royal statement. They encountered it as inherited antiquity. That is a remarkable thought. We tend to compress ancient Egypt into one giant blur of pyramids and pharaohs, but the Egyptians themselves looked back across long spans of time. The Sphinx was capable of being ancient even within antiquity. One of the most famous reminders of this is the dream stele placed between its paws by Thutmose IV. According to the story it preserves, the prince rested in the shadow of the Sphinx and dreamed that the monument promised him kingship if he cleared away the sand covering it. Whether we take the story as literal memory, royal propaganda, or some combination of the two, it tells us something important. The Sphinx was already a buried and revered monument requiring excavation and interpretation. It was not simply there. It had to be recovered, even by people who lived much closer to its creation than we do. That ancient act of recovery feels surprisingly modern. We're still doing it. Not always with shovels, though sometimes with them, but with questions. Every generation clears away a little of the drifted sand of inherited assumptions and tries to decide what the monument really is, what it meant, how it was made, and what happened to it afterward. Some generations are more patient than others, some are more fond of giant claims, but the impulse is continuous. The Sphinx keeps being rediscovered, and perhaps that is the best way to meet it. Not as a solved object and not as an unlimited blank screen for fantasy, but as a monument that becomes more complicated the closer you get. From far away, it is a famous face. From nearer, it is a colossal carved lion body in bedrock. Closer still, it is layered limestone marked by damage and restoration. Then, once you start studying the enclosure walls, it becomes something else again. It becomes evidence, or at least potential evidence. The kind that makes geologists lean forward, Egyptologists begin choosing their words carefully, and viewers at home suddenly realise that the real mystery may not be hidden inside the monument at all. It may be written across its surface, in the marks that weather left behind. Now that we have met the monument a little more carefully, we can move into the part of the mystery that tends to get repeated in documentaries, arguments, comment sections, and late-night internet rabbit holes with varying levels of accuracy. People often say, very confidently, that the Sphinx shows water erosion, or they say, just as confidently, that it absolutely does not. The trouble is that those phrases sound much simpler than the actual claim, and once a claim gets repeated enough times in short form, it starts to behave like a slogan. The slogan is easy, the stone is harder. So let us slow it down and ask the basic question. When people talk about the water erosion idea at the Sphinx, what are they actually saying? They are not usually claiming that someone found the Sphinx underwater like a lost submarine with a royal face. They are not saying that a giant flood once came rushing through Giza and carved the monument in a weekend. They are not, at least in the more serious version of the argument, pointing to one puddle and declaring history rewritten. The claim is more specific than that. It says that the patterns of weathering seen on the body of the Sphinx, and especially on the walls of the enclosure around it, look more consistent with prolonged rainfall and runoff than with wind-driven sand alone. That is the heart of it. In other words, the argument is not really about water, in the broadest possible sense, because lots of environments involve some kind of water. Even deserts have moisture, rare storms, humidity shifts, dew, groundwater movement, and salts brought in and out of stone in very annoying little cycles. The stronger version of the theory is about substantial precipitation, rainfall, repeated wetting over long periods, the kind of climate that can carve, soften, round, channel and wear, expose limestone in ways that look different from the effects usually associated with a dry desert dominated by sand and wind. That distinction matters. If someone says water erosion and leaves it there, the conversation becomes blurry fast. Because yes, of course, water can affect stone in many ways. That is hardly revolutionary. The real question is whether the visible patterns at the Sphinx point to a level and type of rainfall that would place the main erosion in a much wetter climatic period than the standard Old Kingdom date of around 2500 BCE would suggest. That is the part that changes everything. To understand why, imagine two basic weathering stories. In the first story, the Sphinx is carved during the age of the pyramid builders, in a climate already much drier than the green phases that existed earlier in North African prehistory. Over time, the monument is exposed to wind, blowing sand, temperature changes, salt activity, occasional moisture, and long periods of burial and re-exposure. In that story, the erosion is old, real, and serious, but not surprising. It is simply what happens to vulnerable limestone over thousands of years in a difficult setting. In the second story, the erosion patterns are not just old, they are diagnostic. They point to a wetter environment, one with enough rainfall over enough time to create the rounded profiles, vertical channels, and broader surface wear that some geologists believe they see in the enclosure. If that story is correct, then the major erosion had to begin during a climate phase, much earlier than the traditional dating of the monument. That would mean either the Sphinx itself is older than usually believed, or that a significant earlier carved feature existed there, and was later modified into the Sphinx we know. And once you say that, you have walked straight out of a geology discussion and into a historical earthquake. This is why the debate attracts so much heat. The water erosion claim is not just a note about rock texture. It carries chronological consequences. If the weathering really required long exposure to heavy rainfall, then the monument cannot be explained only within the familiar frame of the Fourth Dynasty, without additional argument. Something has to give. Either the geological interpretation is wrong, incomplete, or overstated, or the standard historical dating needs to be reconsidered in some serious way. So what do supporters of the rain erosion idea point to when they make their case? The most common focus is the enclosure around the Sphinx. This is the cut area surrounding the monument, where the living rock was quarried away to leave the carved figure standing within a trench-like space. On these enclosure walls, some observers note patterns that look vertically undulating, rounded, and deeply worn. Instead of appearing sharply faceted, evenly scoured or dominated by horizontal abrasion, parts of the rock seem to them to have been softened and gouged in a way consistent with rainfall flowing down exposed surfaces over a very long time. Think of it this way. If wind-carrying sand is the main sculptor, many people expect something more like abrasion that attacks protruding surfaces, edges, and lower levels in particular ways. If rainwater is the main sculptor, especially on softer limestone exposed in a cut enclosure, it can produce broader wash-like wear, runoff channels, smoothed rounding, and patterns that seem to descend vertically. That is the visual intuition behind the argument, though of course the actual geology is more complicated than a neat side-by-side cartoon. Supporters of the theory often describe the erosion as looking less like something blasted and more like something soaked and worn. Less like a surface sanded down by a dry abrasive wind, and more like a wall repeatedly exposed to water moving over and into it. In ordinary language, they are saying the stone looks rained on, not merely sand blasted. Now this is where people begin talking past each other, because looks rained on is not a scientific conclusion by itself. It is an impression that must then be tested against the properties of the stone, the local geology, known climatic history, excavation history, restoration work, and alternative mechanisms of weathering. But it is the starting impression that made the theory persuasive to many non-specialists. You can stand there, look at the rounded grooves and channels, and feel that it is a reasonable question. Another important piece of the claim involves comparison. Advocates of the rainfall interpretation sometimes compare the enclosure weathering with surfaces elsewhere on the plateau or on structures more securely dated to the Old Kingdom. The idea is that if neighbouring monuments from the same general period do not show the same sort of deep rounded weathering, then perhaps the Sphinx enclosure has had a different and longer environmental history. That does not prove an earlier date by itself, but it strengthens the feeling that the site may not fit neatly into one standard explanation. The argument often goes a step further and notes that the Sphinx was carved from layers of limestone of uneven hardness. Some layers weather faster than others, which can exaggerate grooves and recesses. Supporters of the water erosion theory do not usually deny that. Instead, they say that the variable limestone makes the monument especially responsive to rainfall weathering, and that what we see is exactly what we would expect if water repeatedly exploited those differences over a long wet period. This is where the theory becomes more careful than many summaries make it sound. It is not always claiming that every mark on the Sphinx is from rain. It is claiming that the dominant early weathering pattern, especially in the enclosure, is best explained by precipitation-induced erosion acting on exposed limestone with variable resistance. That is already a more nuanced statement than the slogan version that usually escapes into popular culture. There is also an important chronological claim attached to it. The region around Giza was not always as dry as it is now. North Africa went through much wetter climatic phases in the distant past, especially during what is often called the African humid period, when areas now associated with desert-supported lakes, grasslands, animals, and human communities in a very different environment. Supporters of the Sphinx rainfall hypothesis connect the erosion to one of these wetter eras. Their argument is basically this: if the enclosure shows strong evidence of weathering by significant rainfall, then that weathering most likely began during one of those earlier climatic windows. Since those wetter periods predate the conventional 4th Dynasty date by a very large margin, the monument or its precursor must also be older. Notice the careful wording there. The monument or its precursor. That loophole is important. Some versions of the theory argue directly that the Sphinx itself is far older than mainstream Egyptology allows. Other versions are a little more cautious and suggest that an earlier carved or natural feature may have existed and later been reshaped by the dynastic Egyptians into the Sphinx we recognise. This second version is often used to explain the uncomfortable fact that the head seems small in proportion to the body. If the original carved form had a different head, perhaps larger, and was later recut into a royal face that could help account for the proportions while preserving the possibility of very great antiquity. Once again, the implications are large. A monument older than the Old Kingdom would raise obvious questions. Who made it? In what social and technological setting? Why is there no clear conventional archaeological record announcing such a civilization at Giza at that early date? This is usually the moment when grand speculations arrive wearing very dramatic coats. Lost civilizations, forgotten dynasties, survivors of some cataclysm, the usual parade. But strictly speaking, the erosion claim by itself does not prove any of those stories. It only opens chronological pressure on the accepted timeline. What rushes into that opening afterward is a separate matter. That is worth emphasising because a lot of people either accept or reject the erosion argument based on how they feel about the stories that came attached to it. If someone hears older Sphinx and immediately thinks of Atlantis, then they may reject the geology out of sheer exhaustion, which is understandable. Ancient history has been put through a lot. On the other hand, some people hear older Sphinx and become so delighted by the possibility of hidden antiquity that they treat the geology as settled fact before the actual geological objections have even been considered. That is not ideal either. The stone deserves a little more patience than both of those reactions allow. There is also a smaller but important point buried in the phrase, water erosion itself. Water does not only act dramatically, it can act slowly, chemically, repeatedly, and in combination with the internal weaknesses of the rock. Rainwater can seep into porous limestone, interact with salts and minerals, exploit natural fractures, and gradually break down softer layers. Runoff can travel down a wall not like a waterfall in a movie, but like a persistent habit. Small events repeated enough times can leave large marks. The theory is not saying the Sphinx needed to sit under tropical monsoon conditions with thunder rolling overhead every afternoon for 10,000 years. It is saying the observed weathering is more at home in a wetter climate regime than in the dry desert environment of the standard historical setting. Now, a sensible listener might ask, if that is the claim, why does the debate remain so unresolved? If the rock looks rained on, surely geologists can just settle it. But geology, like history, does not always give quick cinematic answers. Weathering is messy. Limestone is variable. Sites are altered by excavation, restoration, groundwater, salts, human intervention, and changing exposure conditions. The Sphinx has been buried for long stretches and uncovered in phases. Parts of the monument have been repaired with blocks. Surfaces have not all experienced the same conditions. Even defining which marks belong to which phase of weathering can be tricky. So the water erosion claim is not a matter of one magic groove solving history. It is an interpretation of a complicated weathered system. That said, the claim does have a clear core and it helps to state it plainly. Here it is in the simplest useful form. The theory argues that the weathering visible on the Sphinx, and especially on its enclosure walls, is best explained by substantial rainfall and runoff acting over long periods, and that because such wet conditions belong to an earlier climatic era than the Old Kingdom, The origins of the monument must be older than the standard dynastic date, either in whole or in part. That is the claim. Everything else is either support, objection, extension, or storytelling. And there is plenty of all four. Support comes from the visual patterns, geological comparison, and paleoclimate context. Objection comes from alternative explanations involving salt exfoliation, differential weathering, wind, local moisture, and the broader archaeological setting at Giza. Extension comes in the form of hypotheses about recarving, earlier monuments, or revised chronologies. Storytelling arrives in the form it always does, a little too quickly, a little too confidently, usually with ominous music somewhere nearby. Another thing the theory claims, at least implicitly, is that standard archaeological context should not automatically override physical evidence from the stone itself. This is one reason it gained attention. It felt like a challenge not just to a date, but to a method. Should a monument be dated primarily by the cultural and architectural complex in which it sits? Or can the geology of the monument force us to reconsider that context? Advocates of the rainfall interpretation tend to say the stone must be allowed to speak first. Critics tend to answer that the stone is being asked leading questions. That may sound slightly unfair, but it captures the tone of the disagreement. And we should be honest about one more thing. Part of why the water erosion idea became so popular is that it is wonderfully intuitive at first glance. You look at rounded, vertically worn rock in a desert setting, and the thought arrives almost by itself. Rain, older climate, older monument. It has the satisfying shape of a revelation. The danger of revelations, however, is that they feel complete before they are tested. Plenty of things in science and history begin as sharp intuitions and then survive scrutiny. Plenty of others do not. The Sphinx problem remains interesting precisely because the intuition was strong enough to force a serious argument, but not strong enough to end one. So when people say the Sphinx water erosion mystery is about whether the monument was damaged by water, that is too simple. The real issue is whether the particular patterns of weathering imply a rainfall-rich environment so different from later dynastic Egypt that they require a much earlier origin for the monument or the rock-cut form from which it emerged. That is a very specific claim, and it is specific enough to matter. It also changes the mood of the whole site. Suddenly the Sphinx is not just a royal guardian near the pyramids. It becomes a possible survivor from another climatic world, a monument that may carry in its surface the memory of weather Egypt no longer knows. Or, if the mainstream critics are right, it becomes a lesson in how easily stone can tempt us into overreading the past. Either way, the weathered body and enclosure stop being background damage and start becoming the centre of the case. Because once you begin asking what those marks really mean, you are no longer just looking at a famous monument in sand. You're looking at a clock made of limestone, and everyone is arguing about what era it started counting from. One of the easiest mistakes to make in this whole debate is to imagine that the phrase, "the Sahara was once green," is just a dramatic line people use to sell documentaries. It sounds suspiciously like something whispered by a narrator standing in front of a dune at sunset. But in this case, the dramatic line happens to be real. North Africa did pass through wetter phases in the past, and the best-known one in recent prehistory is the African humid period, roughly 11,000 to 5,000 years ago. During that span, areas now associated with open sand and extreme dryness supported much more vegetation, more wetlands, and in some regions lakes and active drainage systems. So before anyone even says the word Sphinx, it is important to understand that the idea of a wetter Sahara is not fringe material. That part is mainstream paleoclimate science. That does not mean the Sahara turned into a giant uniform park with convenient shade trees every few metres and antelopes politely posing for archaeological sketches. Green Sahara is a modern nickname, and like most nicknames, it is useful but a little too neat. What researchers are really talking about is a major shift in rainfall, vegetation, lakes, and ecosystems across a vast region. with strong local variation. Some places would have been grassland or steppe, some supported wetlands and seasonal water, some held lakes, and some likely remained much drier than the popular image suggests. Even experts who fully accept the African humid period still debate exactly how wet different parts of the Sahara became, and how consistently that moisture was distributed across time and space. Still, the broad picture is striking enough on its own. Noah summarises the early to mid-Holocene Sahara as a steppe covered in grasses and shrubs rather than the sandy desert familiar today, and NASA notes that vegetation, wetlands, and perhaps even large lakes occupied areas now dominated by sand. Nature's 2023 review of North African humid periods adds that proxy evidence indicates rivers, lakes, and vegetation spread into what is now desert during these wetter phases. In other words, if someone from modern Cairo were somehow dropped into parts of North Africa during one of those greener intervals, the first reaction would probably not be, "Ah yes, exactly as expected." It would be more along the lines of, "I was told this was a desert, and instead there are lakes, grazing animals, and a climate making very serious promises it will not keep forever." The reason this happened is not magic, and it is not because the Sahara periodically gets bored and tries on a different personality. The leading explanation centres on orbital forcing. Small changes in Earth's orbit and precession altered the seasonal distribution of solar energy, especially northern hemisphere summer insolation. That strengthened the African monsoon and pushed summer rains farther north than they reach today. Nature's recent synthesis describes these humid periods as astronomically paced by precession, while the OUP review on Green Sahara periods explains that stronger summer insolation enhanced monsoon penetration into the present-day Sahara. NASA's summary of current thinking says the same basic thing in planar form. Subtle orbital shifts likely helped intensify and reposition the North African monsoon. Small changes in the sky over long enough time can move entire climate belts on the ground. But orbital forcing alone does not seem to tell the whole story. Climate researchers have spent years trying to understand why some models struggle to produce enough rainfall to match the lushness suggested by lake deposits, vegetation evidence, and other proxies. The current picture is that Earth's orbital changes helped start the process, but land-atmosphere feedbacks likely amplified it. More vegetation darkened the ground compared with bright desert surfaces. Soils and lakes changed local heat balance and moisture recycling, and the whole system became better at sustaining rainfall than a bare sand landscape would be. This is one reason the Green Sahara remains scientifically interesting even outside the Sphinx debate. It is a reminder that climate systems can shift, not just because an external driver nudges them, but because the land itself starts cooperating with the new pattern once the shift begins. Now, if we bring Egypt into the picture, things become more interesting and more complicated. Egypt is often imagined as climatically simple because the modern map seems so straightforward. Nile ribbon, desert all around, very dry. But Holocene Egypt did not respond as one giant uniform block. Evidence from the Fayum oasis shows that a permanent lake appeared there around 10,000 calibrated years before present, with freshwater conditions during the end of the early and middle Holocene. That same record indicates repeated oscillations between deeper, more humid phases and shallower, more brackish phases, followed by increasing brackish conditions after about 6.2 thousand years ago as the system dried. So even in northern Egypt, in an area now clearly arid, the hydrological story of the Holocene was dynamic rather than fixed. The Fayum record also matters because it introduces a nuance people often miss when they hear monsoon reached Egypt. The researchers note that the freshwater supply there was closely tied to Nile inflow during flood seasons, when the intertropical convergence zone shifted northward in Africa, while local rainfall may also have mattered during winter through more northerly circulation. In other words, wetter Egypt did not simply mean rain falling the same way everywhere from one atmospheric source. Different parts of Egypt could be influenced by different hydrological mechanisms at the same time. Southern catchments, Nile flood behaviour, monsoon reach, seasonal rainfall, basin storage, and local geology all mattered. That is important because whenever someone says the Sahara was green, therefore Giza must have had heavy rainfall for ages, they're jumping over a lot of regional complexity in a single leap. This is where the Green Sahara becomes especially relevant to the Sphinx, but not in the simplistic way it is sometimes presented. The wet Sahara is not itself proof that the Sphinx was carved in deep prehistory. What it does provide is climatic plausibility. It tells us that a much wetter North Africa is not an invention. There really were times when monsoon systems pushed northward, lakes expanded, vegetation spread, and environments now barren looked very different. So the advocates of rainfall erosion at the Sphinx are not inventing ancient rain from thin air. They are pointing to a known prehistoric climate regime and asking whether the rock at Giza preserves marks that belong to it. That is a more serious question than many critics first assume, even if it does not automatically settle the case in their favour. And to be fair, mainstream scholars do not usually deny the wetter Sahara at all. The disagreement is not over whether North Africa had humid phases. The disagreement is over timing, local effect, and geological interpretation. Critics of the old Sphinx theory can comfortably agree that the Sahara was much greener in the early Holocene, and still argue that the Sphinx itself belongs to the Old Kingdom. Those two positions are not contradictory. The real argument is whether the specific weathering visible at Giza requires exposure during one of those wetter phases. That is why this section matters. We are not gathering exotic background scenery. We are building the climate setting that makes the later geological dispute meaningful rather than theatrical. There is also a human side to this greener world that is easy to overlook. N.O. Kia A notes that in this more inviting environment, people and animals spread into regions that later became far harder to inhabit. Archaeology across the Sahara records pastoral communities, symbolic art, and settlement around water sources in landscapes that today feel almost aggressively unsuitable for that kind of life. It is one of the strangest lessons of prehistory that places we now treat as naturally empty were sometimes full of movement, adaptation, and human routine. A dry basin that now looks like the kind of place you would cross only if absolutely necessary could once have been part of somebody's seasonal pattern, somebody's herd route, somebody's fishing ground, or somebody's ordinary afternoon. That shift in imagination is useful. It helps us stop treating the current desert as the timeless default. Even the lake story needs careful handling. The image of megalakes across the Sahara has become popular, but the literature is more cautious. A 2018 review in Quaternary Research confirms that the Sahara was wetter and greener during African humid period conditions and discusses proposed large lakes, yet it also concludes that clear evidence for truly gigantic mega-lake systems is limited outside certain basins such as Lake Chad. That is a helpful corrective. The wetter Sahara was real, but not every grand reconstruction should be accepted at full volume. Some parts of the past were watery in ways that are strongly documented. Other claims are larger and more uncertain. For our purposes, that is actually good news, because careful limits make the stronger evidence more trustworthy. We do not need every dune to become a shoreline to accept that North Africa once held far more moisture than it does now. The drying that followed is another place where popular retellings often flatten the story too much. NOAA points to an abrupt decrease in Saharan vegetation around 5,000 years ago in some marine sediment records, while the Fayum record shows a more regionally textured transition, with increasing brackish conditions after about 6.2 thousand years ago, and a broader aridification trend that local researchers describe as beginning around the end of the African humid period and accelerating in Egypt from roughly 4.5 thousand years ago. So rather than imagining one single day when someone woke up, looked outside and said, "Well, that is the end of the lakes then," it is better to picture a shifting mosaic. Different records capture different parts of the transition, and local hydrology could preserve water longer in some places even as the broader climate dried. That timing matters a great deal for Giza. By the age traditionally associated with Khufu and Khafra in the 3rd millennium BCE, the great humid phase of the early Holocene was no longer in full force. Egypt was not sitting inside the lushest version of the Green Sahara when the pyramids were built. Yet it was also not entirely disconnected from the long after effects of earlier wetter conditions, especially through Nile hydrology and the changing landscapes inherited from that wetter past. This middle position is easy to lose in polarised debates. The world of the pyramid builders was already much drier than the early Holocene, but it was not living in ignorance of water, flood regimes or terrain shaped by older climatic phases. Ancient builders worked on a landscape with memory, even if that memory was already fading into stone and sediment rather than daily weather. And this, quietly, is why the Green Sahara chapter belongs in the middle of a Sphinx story. Without it, the rain erosion hypothesis sounds like a wild attempt to smuggle tropical weather into a desert, where it plainly does not belong. With it, the hypothesis becomes something more disciplined. Not correct by default, but possible in principle. It says, look, North Africa really did host wetter regimes. Egypt really did experience major Holocene hydrological change. Northern basins really did preserve records of freshwater phases and later drying. Monsoon systems really did shift. The desert we know is not the only desert that ever existed there. Once that is understood, the question becomes narrower and sharper. Did the stone at Giza record enough of that wetter world to force a change in the accepted age of the Sphinx? Or are we asking the climate story to do more work than the geology can honestly support? There is something almost humbling about that older landscape. We tend to treat deserts as permanent and rivers as reliable, but on long time scales both can behave quite differently. The Sahara has not always been what it is now, and Egypt has not always sat inside the same environmental assumptions modern visitors bring with them. A greener North Africa is not fantasy. It is a chapter of real Earth history, written in lake cores, dust records, vegetation traces, and shifting hydrology. The reason the Sphinx debate refuses to go away is that the monument seems to sit with one paw in the known dynastic world and the other in a geological argument about that deeper climatic past. And once you allow yourself to remember that this desert once held more rain, more grass, more water, and more life than the eye expects, the next thing you naturally start looking at is not the face of the Sphinx at all. It is the enclosure walls, because that is where the stone begins to look less like a symbol and more like a weather report from a world that no longer exists. The reason the debate became so intense is that the Sphinx enclosure does not look the way many people expect a monument in open desert to look. The familiar face gets most of the attention, but the real argument gathered force down in the cut walls around the body, where the stone appears deeply worn, rounded in places, and marked by broad vertical undulations that do not fit the simple postcard idea of a statue quietly sitting in sand. Geologist Colin Reeder wrote that features of weathering and erosion within the enclosure suggest the action of flowing water, and Robert Schocher's widely noticed early 1990s intervention pushed that impression into the public spotlight by arguing that the weathering patterns on and around the Sphinx required a much earlier date than the standard 4th dynasty placement. This is what gave the walls their strange power in the argument. The face can inspire endless speculation, but the enclosure seems, at first glance, more practical and less symbolic. It looks like evidence rather than iconography. A face can be stylized, reworked, damaged, or idealized. A wall, especially a quarried wall, feels blunt and literal. It feels like it ought to record what happened to the stone after the workers cut it. So when people stood inside or above the enclosure and saw surfaces that looked washed, softened and channeled rather than merely scraped, the walls began to seem less like background and more like witnesses. That shift from monument to weathered surface is what turned a famous statue into a geological argument. Reeder's own formulation is useful because it is more careful than the popular slogan. He did not simply say the walls prove immense antiquity. He said the enclosure shows features suggesting flowing water and that the erosion is not uniformly distributed, which in his view fits rainfall runoff rather than generalised rainfall falling evenly everywhere. That point matters because it narrows the visual claim. People were not only reacting to the idea of water in the abstract, they were reacting to the placement and form of the weathering, to the impression that water had moved down particular surfaces, exploited particular weaknesses, and done so in a way that seemed directional and cumulative. Once that impression takes hold, the desert setting begins to work against the conventional timeline in the imagination. The ordinary viewer thinks of Giza as dry, windy, sandy, and unhelpfully bright. In that mental landscape, broad, rounded weathering with strong vertical character feels out of place. This is part of the reason the controversy spread so fast outside specialist circles. The claim was visually intuitive. Many people could stand before photographs of the enclosure and feel that the walls looked more like something shaped by repeated wetting and runoff than by steady abrasion from desert winds alone. Even when specialists objected, the first impression remained stubbornly strong. Schocher's 1992 announcement gave that intuition a date, and therefore a dramatic consequence. As the New Yorker later summarised the dispute, Schoch argued that weathering patterns on and around the Sphinx led him to revise its creation from around 2600 BC to at least 5000 BC. That was more than a geological note. It was a direct challenge to the standard historical framework of Giza. Once the enclosure walls were treated as a climatic clue rather than ordinary damage, they began to threaten the entire accepted sequence of who carved the monument and when. A debate about stone shape became a debate about the chronology of one of the most famous sites on Earth. There is another reason the enclosure mattered so much. The Sphinx was not carved as an isolated block. Mark Lehner's mapping and geological work with Thomas Aigner tied the ditch around the Sphinx directly to the construction of the Sphinx temple. In Lehner's account, the large limestone core blocks of the temple walls match the geological layers running through the bedrock of the Sphinx itself, meaning those blocks had to come from the U-shaped ditch around the monument. In other words, the enclosure is not just nearby scenery, it is part of the monument's birth certificate, because the ditch and the temple blocks belong to the same quarrying operation. That makes the walls chronologically dangerous. If they are reinterpreted, the temple sequence and the broader Khafre discussion are immediately pulled into the argument as well. This is exactly why mainstream archaeologists responded so strongly. Lehner's work argues that the Sphinx and Sphinx temple belong to the same quarry construction sequence, and that the lower parts of the monument and its quarry were created in connection with Khafre's building project. Ayera's reconstruction adds that the work appears unfinished, with abandoned blocks, interrupted quarry edges, and archaeological signs that the Sphinx temple was never fully completed or fully activated as a cult centre in the Old Kingdom. In that reading, the enclosure walls do not sit outside the historical context. They are embedded within it. The more tightly the quarry, temple, and Khafre complex are linked, the harder it becomes to let the enclosure wander off into a much earlier age on its own. So the walls became contested terrain in a very literal sense. To one side, they seemed to preserve environmental evidence that could force the date backward. To the other side, they were already locked into a 4th dynasty construction sequence by archaeology, architecture, and quarry relationships. This is one reason the conversation turned so sharp so quickly. Neither side was arguing about a decorative detail. They were arguing about the most stubborn kind of evidence, the kind that appears material and mute and therefore oddly trustworthy. The walls looked like they should settle something. Instead, they made everything less settled. The visual character of the enclosure helped the controversy because it is genuinely dramatic. The walls are not evenly neat, not crisply cut, and not preserved in some ideal textbook state. They rise around the Sphinx with a weathered, scarred appearance that feels older than the tidy modern labels attached to it. In places, the surfaces look deeply recessed. In places, they look rounded rather than sharply broken. Even critics of the older date theory generally do not deny that the enclosure has undergone serious deterioration. The disagreement begins with what kind of deterioration it is, how much of it occurred when, and whether some of what looks like pure weathering may actually include quarry marks, later cutbacks, structural weakness, or exposure of older natural features already present in the rock. That last point is easy to miss, and very important. The enclosure walls are not pristine surfaces waiting in a laboratory tray for inspection. They are the exposed flanks of a quarried space cut into variable limestone. The lower portions of the Sphinx and floor include rough and brittle limestone, while the monument as a whole was carved from different geological units with different resistance to decay. A 1990 study of the Sphinx limestones emphasised that their pore systems vary from one stratum to another, and later work on the monument's surroundings noted that high relative humidity near the Sphinx can activate soluble salts and contribute to surface deterioration. That means the walls do not weather as one single material under one single process. They respond unevenly because the stone itself is uneven. Once uneven stone enters the story, the enclosure becomes much harder to read with confidence. One set of researchers can look at rounded surfaces and see runoff. Another can look at the same rounded surfaces and say that arid weathering, changing lithology, and even older karstic features exposed by excavation can produce a similar profile without requiring an extreme redating. Kale and colleagues argued in 1995 that arid environment weathering could generate the rounded profile, and that some channels may reflect pre-existing karst features exposed when the ditch was cut. This is one reason the debate has lasted. The walls are visually forceful but geologically ambiguous. They look decisive from a distance and complicated up close. The public version of the controversy often leaves out another major complication, which is restoration. Much of the Sphinx visible today includes masonry, added to preserve shape and protect the bedrock from further loss. Aera notes that stone blocks of varying size were used to encase native rock, that Roman restoration employed relatively soft white limestone, and that the French engineer Émile Barrès reset much of the Roman stone during excavations from 1926 to 1936, though his years of work were never fully published, and some architectural phases around the Sphinx were dismantled without proper documentation. This does not erase the older weathering, but it means the monument and its enclosure come to us through layers of intervention. The walls are not only ancient surfaces, they're also partially curated ruins. That restoration history matters because the debate often sounds as if observers are reading untouched geology. They are not. They are reading geology after burial, exposure, ancient repairs, Roman repairs, modern excavation, undocumented disturbance, and conservation campaigns. Even before one argues about rainfall, there is the practical problem of deciding which visible forms belong to the original cut, which belong to later deterioration, which belong to loss after centuries of exposure, and which are entangled with repairs. Once a monument has been saved repeatedly, every surface becomes a layered conversation between original stone and later survival. The enclosure walls started so much debate because they look direct, but in practice they are anything but simple. There is also the issue of burial by sand, which changes the style of weathering. For much of its life, the Sphinx was not fully open to the air in the way modern photographs suggest. Sand could trap moisture, encourage salt movement, and create conditions very different from simple dry exposure. Conservation and geological discussions around the Sphinx have long pointed to multiple culprits, including wind and sand erosion, rising groundwater, salts, humidity, and modern environmental stress. Getty-related conservation work in the early 1990s also identified continual salt crystallization as at least part of the explanation for deterioration, and later environmental research around the monument stressed that frequent high relative humidity could drive damaging salt activity. So even if the enclosure looks washed, the The site also lived through long phases in which moisture and salts could work from within and under the surface, rather than only from obvious rainfall above. This is where the walls become almost unfairly persuasive. They invite the eye to simplify. A person sees big, rounded cuts and thinks in big, dramatic causes. But stone rarely obeys our preference for one clean explanation. A brittle lower member, a more durable upper member, ancient joints in the rock, runoff during wetter phases, moisture retained by sand, salt crystallization, and centuries of partial burial can all leave marks that overlap, exaggerate, and confuse one another. The enclosure started so much debate because it seemed to promise a single answer in visible form, while the actual geology insisted on a mixture of processes. Another reason the walls drew attention is that they seem to offer a more independent line of evidence than inscriptions or dynastic style. The Sphinx is not helpfully labelled by its makers in the way modern visitors might prefer, so researchers leaned harder on indirect evidence. Archaeologists use site relationships, causeways, temple plans, and quarry sequences. Geologists used weathering profiles, stone quality, and erosion distribution. The enclosure walls became appealing because they seemed to bypass arguments about royal portraiture and dynastic attribution. If the stone itself could be read, then perhaps it could settle what art history and archaeology only inferred. That hope was always a little optimistic, but it explains the fascination. The walls looked like a chance to let the monument testify against or for its accepted age. The irony is that both sides can point to the same enclosure and feel confirmed. Supporters of an older origin see weathering that looks too severe and too run-off shaped to belong comfortably inside the standard Old Kingdom framework. More cautious critics see a monument cut from poor and variable limestone, embedded in a 4th dynasty construction sequence, then battered by salts, humidity, burial and repairs. Neither side is looking at an imaginary wall. Both are looking at the same stone. The fight is over which history of processes best explains it. That is a deeper disagreement than it first appears, because it is not just about age, it is about method, about whether chronology should be led primarily by archaeological sequence or by geomorphological reading, when the two seem to pull in different directions. The walls also have one great advantage in the public imagination. They are memorable. The face of the Sphinx is famous, but weathering on a face can be dismissed as damage. Weathering on a whole enclosure feels like a pattern. Patterns are what human beings trust, and also what human beings overtrust. Once people heard phrases like vertical weathering, rounded profiles and run-off channels, they began to see the enclosure as the true centre of the mystery. It no longer mattered that the monument stood beside pyramids and temples with their own context. The walls seemed to carry a separate story, one written in a language older than inscriptions and therefore, to many minds, more honest. That is precisely why they started so much debate. They looked like the sort of evidence that should be beyond argument, and then they turned out to be made entirely of argument. So when people say the Sphinx enclosure looks washed, that phrase is doing a great deal of work. It refers to the rounded and undulating surfaces that made runoff and rainfall seem plausible. It refers to a visual mismatch between popular expectations of desert abrasion and the actual form of the walls. It refers to the way those walls appear more like weather history than royal symbolism. And it refers to the fact that the enclosure is structurally tied to the monument's quarrying and temple construction, which means any rereading of the walls threatens to rearrange the accepted story of Giza itself. The walls did not start debate because they were obscure. They started debate because they looked vivid, physical, and almost insultingly direct, while the closer anyone studied them, the less direct they became. That is the atmosphere we need to keep in mind going forward. Not a miracle hidden in plain sight, and not a trivial misunderstanding that should have vanished years ago, but a set of surfaces that genuinely push people into disagreement because they look like they record something important and refuse to say exactly what it was. And once the eye is trained on those walls, the next step is unavoidable, because the whole dispute tightens around the details of their shape, the vertical grooves, the rounded recesses, and the strange patterns that made one side think of rain and another side think of stone behaving exactly as difficult stone does. What makes the Sphinx enclosure so hard to read is that the stone does not weather like a smooth wall in a textbook diagram. It weathers in layers, in patches, along weaknesses, around cracks, and according to the quality of the limestone itself. So when people stand in front of those walls and say, "That looks like rain," or "That just looks like bad limestone," they're each responding to something real, but they are not necessarily responding to the whole picture. The enclosure is full of patterns that seem clear at first glance, and then grow more difficult the longer you stay with them. That is why this part of the argument matters so much. The stone does not speak with one voice, it speaks unevenly. The most famous of those patterns is the one people usually describe as vertical weathering. That phrase can make it sound as if someone neatly measured a set of straight rain lines down the walls and closed the case. What people actually mean is messier. On parts of the enclosure, especially the western segments that attracted the most attention, the weathered faces show broad, sub-vertical undulations and recesses. They look less like crisp desert cut edges, and more like surfaces that have been rounded, softened, and carved back in irregular descending forms. Schocker's early argument leaned heavily on what he called the rolling, undulating profile of the enclosure walls, while later summaries of the dispute kept returning to the same visual impression. The erosion seemed to go down the walls rather than simply across them. That is the visual hook of the whole mystery. Wind, in the popular imagination, works sideways. Rain, in the popular imagination, works downward. So when viewers see downward-looking patterns in a desert enclosure, their minds naturally start filing the rock under rain. It is almost too intuitive. And that, strangely, is part of the problem. Intuitive geological arguments can be helpful, but they can also trick us into collapsing several different processes into a single simple picture. The Sphinx walls do show downward-oriented and rounded weathering patterns that made rainfall seem plausible to Schoch and later to Reader. But those same walls also contain joints, variable limestone beds, pre-existing fractures, and evidence of later chemical weathering, all of which can reshape how those vertical-looking forms develop. The rounded cuts are the next part of the puzzle. Critics of the older date theory often point out that rounded stone is not a magical signature of prehistoric rainfall. Gori, Sinai and Bandyopadhyay argued in 1995 that the rounded profile of the Sphinx's limestone layers could arise in an arid environment because the stone itself alternates between harder and softer strata. In that model, weaker beds retreat faster than stronger ones. Salt weathering, moisture movement, and ordinary exposure gradually hollow and soften the profile until the wall no longer looks sharp-edged. In other words, rounded surfaces do not automatically mean wet climate antiquity. They can also mean weak limestone taking a long, slow beating under desert conditions. That objection matters because it goes straight at the visual drama of the older Sphinx claim. If a rounded surface can be produced by present-day or historically recent weathering in variable limestone, then the stone becomes much less dramatic as a clock. It no longer points so confidently to a vanished green world. It might just be what happens when friable limestone is exposed, patched, buried, uncovered, and assaulted by salts and moisture for a very long time. ERA's mapping project emphasises exactly that vulnerability, describing the lion body as poor-quality limestone that required restoration beginning in antiquity, and noting that the friable native stone still erodes daily. That is not the language of a monument carved from heroic eternal rock. It is the language of a monument built from difficult material, and yet the older date supporters were not simply staring at random softness and calling it revelation. They were noticing something more specific about distribution. Reader's work is especially important here because he tried to refine the claim away from the broad idea of rain happened, toward the more exact question of where runoff would have gone and which walls should therefore show stronger damage. In his account, the selective degradation of the western enclosure walls fits a pattern in which runoff from an intact plateau discharged downslope into that part of the enclosure before later 4th Dynasty quarrying disrupted the hydrology. He even argues that rainfall runoff alone does not force a date earlier than the 4th Dynasty, but that the particular distribution of the anomalous degradation does, because later upslope quarrying would have intercepted runoff and protected the enclosure from more of the same process. That is a very different claim from the cartoon version repeated in popular retellings. Reader is not just saying, look, vertical grooves, therefore ancient rain, therefore mystery solved. He is saying the location and pattern of the degradation matter. If one part of the enclosure is heavily degraded and another clearly later cut face in the same general area is comparatively fresh, then the difference may record different ages of exposure. In his 2005 paper, he points to a member 1 exposure around the base of the enclosure, where a later 4th Dynasty cutting shows comparatively little degradation beside more intensely degraded rock beyond it. To reader, this contrast suggests that the more damaged surfaces are older than the later excavation. To critics, it is still not enough to overthrow the accepted chronology. But it is much more precise than the slogan version of the theory. This is where the stone really starts speaking unevenly, because different researchers are not always arguing over the same marks. One side focuses on the broad shape of the wall profile and the way certain surfaces seem scooped, rounded, and vertically organised. Another side zooms in on fractures and says those are not clean rainfall channels at all, but widened joints, some of which likely existed before the enclosure was ever cut. Van der Cruz, reviewing the debate, argued that many of the subvertical fissures on the rear wall share similar orientation and are almost certainly of tectonic origin, with water then widening already existing weaknesses rather than creating them from scratch. In that reading, the patterns are real but misleading if treated as direct inscriptions of rainfall. That distinction between creating a feature and exploiting a feature is one of the most important in the whole controversy. Imagine an old crack in limestone. Water gets into it, salts crystallize, the edges break down, the opening widens, the surface around it rounds off. After enough time, what you see is a dramatic recess that looks like one coherent erosional form. But in historical terms, it may be a composite object, part inherited fracture, part chemical decay, part removal of loosened material, part local runoff, part microclimate. The enclosure walls are full of opportunities for exactly that kind of overlap. When Schoch and others emphasize solution features following joints and faults, they are acknowledging that the rock already had a structure before the weathering intensified. The argument is about what kind of environment then did most of the visible work. There is also the matter of lithology, which is a lovely technical word for the character of the rock itself, and in this case it is annoyingly important. The Sphinx and its enclosure are carved from different geological members of the Makatam formation, and those layers are not equally durable. Era notes that core blocks for the Sphinx temple were taken from the lowest layers of member 2 in the quarry, showing how closely the monument and its geology are tied to one another. Gowry's critique depends on this variability. Softer and harder beds weather at different speeds, so a wall can develop niches, ledges, recesses and rounded transitions without requiring one single dramatic external cause. If you cut a monument into bad, uneven limestone, the stone begins writing its own uneven history almost immediately. That unevenness is one reason the Sphinx body itself is tricky evidence. Some advocates of the older weathering view have pointed to the rounded profile of the thorax and lower body as support, arguing that these surfaces resemble precipitation-induced weathering more than ordinary desert abrasion. But critics answer that the body is exactly where current weathering remains intense, and where any supposedly ancient relic surface should have been heavily overprinted by later damage. Gowry and colleagues say directly that modern weathering in these strata is so strong that any much older profile should have been obliterated. In other words, the body may look ancient because it is badly weathered, but bad weathering itself makes it unreliable as a clean time marker. Then there are the strange patterns that are not easily reduced to either simple rainfall or simple wind. Some channels and cavities may be related to karst processes, that is, dissolution features formed by water, moving through limestone long before the Sphinx ditch exposed them to view. Gary's team argued that deep channels in the enclosure walls are pre-Pliocene karst features, formed by underground water and later revealed by excavation. Van der Kruijs, while disagreeing on some points with Reader, also treats karstic behaviour and subsurface water movement as serious factors in how the walls should be read. Once those possibilities enter the discussion, the enclosure becomes less like a wall painted by one climate event and more like a geological palimpsest, a surface where ancient structure and later exposure interact in complicated ways. This is why broad statements like "the erosion is vertical" can be both true and incomplete. Yes, the eye sees verticality, but is that verticality produced by water running down the face from above, by water emerging or concentrating along joints, by the widening of already sub-vertical tectonic fractures, by weaker beds collapsing back between tougher ones, by salts mobilized through moisture and sand that covered the monument for long periods? In practice, several of these processes can contribute at once. Van der Kruijs goes so far as to say there is really no such thing as one single cause at the Sphinx, and that geology by itself is an insufficiently accurate standalone dating method because of the many factors involved in the erosion and weathering of the monument and enclosure. That is not a flashy conclusion, but it is an honest one. Even the meaning of water starts getting slippery here. In the public imagination, water means rainstorm. In the geological arguments, water can mean rainwater dissolving calcite, runoff washing away debris, groundwater seepage, capillary movement, condensation, humidity-driven salt activity, or moisture trapped by surrounding sand. Van der Kruijs makes this explicit when he notes that salt weathering is itself triggered by moisture penetrating the subsurface through capillary action, dew, rain, fog, or groundwater. So in one sense, nearly everybody in the debate agrees that water matters. They disagree over which kind of water matters most, at what time, and with what chronological consequences. The mystery is not water versus no water. It is which water history is recorded in the wall. That helps explain why the same enclosure can produce such different readings. Schock sees vertical and inclined solution features following joints and faults, and argues for prolonged and extensive rainfall acting in a much wetter climate than historical Egypt knew. Reader sees anomalous degradation distribution and ties it to runoff over an intact plateau before later quarrying changed the drainage. Gary sees rounded profiles and deep channels that can be explained without a radically older monument, through lithological variation, arid weathering, and older karst features. Van der Kruijs argues that the visible morphology can be explained by groundwater seepage and salt weathering without requiring a revised chronology. Meanwhile, AERA reminds everyone that the stone itself is poor quality, has been restored repeatedly, and still deteriorates under modern conditions. None of these are invented positions. They are all attempts to make one difficult wall behave like a stable source of history. The body of the Sphinx adds another layer of unease because it is not proportioned or preserved in a way that calms anyone down. The head is carved from harder rock and has survived better than the body below, which makes the monument visually top-heavy in terms of preservation. The lower body, by contrast, lives in weaker stone and shows heavier deterioration. This difference can create the feeling that the monument was worked in stages, or that the lower portions have an older story than the upper portions. Sometimes that is used to support recarving theories. Sometimes it is used simply to show how deceptive preservation can be when the geology changes from one layer to the next. Either way, the monument offers an almost unfair visual contrast. A more durable head above a more vulnerable body, all set inside walls that appear to have suffered differently again. There is also the practical issue of later intervention. The surfaces people study are not untouched. Ancient restorations, Roman repairs, modern excavation, undocumented dismantling during Brazer's campaigns, and later conservation all complicate the visual field. A. Era points out that blocks of varying size encase parts of the native rock, and that repair work began in antiquity. So even when someone says, "Look at that rounded form," the first question has to be, which part exactly? Original bedrock? Ancient repair? Roman stone? A cut-back face? A later loss beside an earlier patch? The wall is not lying, but it is layered. That makes it hard to treat any single profile as a simple message from one remote moment. And then there is sand, the quiet accomplice in almost every problem at Giza. The enclosure did not remain open and clean for millennia. Sand buried the monument repeatedly. Moisture could be trapped in that covering, salts could migrate, and the microclimate of the buried surfaces could be very different from the open-air cliff face image that people carry in their minds. Critics of the rainfall hypothesis often emphasize that moisture-laden sand and capillary salt action can do a tremendous amount of damage without requiring a prehistoric monsoon episode to finish the job. That does not erase the runoff argument, but it does mean that any visible recess or rounded edge might be the child of more than one parent. This is why the enclosure feels so strange when you actually stay with it. The patterns are not random, they are meaningful, but they are meaningful in too many possible ways at once. The vertical-looking weathering may be partly runoff, partly joint widening, partly the retreat of weaker beds, partly long-term chemical decay. The rounded cuts may look like rainfall to one eye and like salt-weathered limestone to another. The odd contrast between heavily degraded and less degraded faces may suggest different ages of cutting, or different exposure histories, or both. The stone is not silent, but it is not straightforward either. It gives clues in overlapping handwriting. That, more than anything, is why the mystery endured. If the enclosure had shown only sharp, clean wind-cut faces, the rainfall argument would likely have died quickly. If it had shown only soft, uniform decay in obviously bad limestone, the argument might never have caught fire. Instead, the walls offered exactly the sort of mixed signal that keeps debates alive for decades. They looked dramatic enough to raise a serious challenge and complicated enough to resist a final answer. The strange patterns did not end the conversation. They created it. And once those patterns were on the table, it was almost inevitable that a geologist willing to press the issue would step into the centre of the controversy and give the whole dispute a name, a date range, and a target no Egyptologist could ignore. There are mysteries that remain interesting because nobody with real credentials has ever touched them. And then there are mysteries that become truly difficult because somebody with real credentials does touch them and refuses to go away. That was the change Robert Schoch brought to the Sphinx debate in the early 1990s. Before he entered the picture, the idea of an older Sphinx already existed in alternative historical circles, especially through John Anthony West. But once a geologist from Boston University walked up to the enclosure walls, studied the limestone, and began saying in public that the weathering looked wrong for the standard date, the conversation changed. It did not become settled. It became dangerous, at least for anyone who preferred the question to remain quiet. In 1990, Schoch travelled to Egypt with John Anthony West specifically to examine the Great Sphinx from a geological perspective, and in 1991 Schoch and West presented Redating the Great Sphinx of Giza, Egypt, at the Geological Society of America's annual meeting. The following year, Schoch published Redating the Great Sphinx of Giza in KMT, which is the point where the argument really stepped out of private fascination and into public dispute. That shift matters because Schoch was not introduced to the wider public as a novelist, mystic, or television personality. He arrived as a trained geologist, and that gave the claim a different texture. The New Yorker described him in 1997 as a respected geologist at Boston University, and Colin Reeder later summarised his intervention in much the same way, writing that in the early 1990s Schoch published a paper concluding that the Great Sphinx was significantly older than generally thought after studying the limestones from which it was carved and seeing in them evidence for rain erosion. Reeder's summary is helpful because it captures the intellectual force of the moment. Schoch was not merely repeating the old mood of something about this feels ancient. He was saying the rock itself suggested a wetter climatic regime, and therefore a deeper antiquity than conventional Egyptology allowed. This is where his role becomes especially important. West had long argued that the Sphinx looked older than the accepted timeline, but Schoch translated that suspicion into geological language. He focused on the rounded, deeply weathered profiles on the Sphinx, and especially on the enclosure walls, arguing that the most prominent weathering pattern was caused by prolonged and extensive rainfall rather than ordinary desert wind. Reeder's later summary of Schoch's original position is very direct. Schoch believed there had not been substantial rains in Egypt since the end of a post-glacial wet phase that ended around 5000 BC, and because the exposed limestones would themselves have needed time to degrade, he argued that the Sphinx must predate 5000 BC and perhaps go back as far as 7000 BC. The New Yorker's 1997 account likewise summarises Schoch's claim as a revision of the Sphinx's date from around 2600 BC to at least 5000 BC, based on rounded, highly eroded weathering patterns that, in his view, looked like water rather than wind. That was the moment the argument stopped being merely eccentric and became genuinely disruptive. If the monument had to be older than 5000 BC, then it could not be neatly folded into Khafra's accepted 4th Dynasty building program, around 2500 BC without some major change in the story. Either the Sphinx itself had to be radically older, or some earlier monument or carved form had to exist on the site, and later be reworked into the dynastic monument we know. Reeder notes that this early date was anathema to Egyptologists, who conventionally assign the Sphinx to Khafra, and that Egyptologists were quick to point out the lack of archaeological evidence for a civilization in Egypt capable of creating such a monument in the 6th or 7th millennium BC. That tension is important. Schoch was reopening the question not because he had found a tidy alternative civilization waiting in the sand, but because he thought the stone was forcing a chronological problem that archaeology had not solved. And this is one of the reasons the debate became so vivid so quickly. Schoch's argument was bold, but it also had a quality that many people found intellectually appealing. He seemed to be saying, in effect, start with the monument itself. Start with the weathering. Start with the physical evidence before the inherited labels. That method has a certain charm because it feels scientific in the most direct sense. Look at the object. Describe the marks. Infer the process. Then ask what kind of timeline that process implies. Even people with no background in geology could understand the structure of the argument, and that made it powerful. It felt less like romantic storytelling, and more like a professional act of noticing. The old mystery had suddenly acquired field notes. Of course, in science, noticing something is only the beginning. The next stage is what happened almost immediately. Challenge, criticism, rebuttal, and the most academic version of I am not persuaded that can be performed with dignity while standing near a famous monument. Schoch's hypothesis did not land in a quiet room. It landed at the intersection of geology, archaeology, Egyptology, conservation, tourism, and a public already primed to believe that Egypt must be hiding something outrageous. Reeder later wrote that his own research on the age of the Sphinx was largely undertaken in response to Schoch's work, and AERA's Sphinx bibliography shows how quickly Mark Lehner and others moved to document, reconstruct, and defend the monument within its broader archaeological context, including Lehner's 1992 and 1994 publications responding to the West Schoch hypothesis. In other words, Schoch did not just raise a question, he forced other specialists to tighten their answers. Another reason Schoch reopened the matter so effectively is that he did not restrict himself to the visible surface. In 1991, a team consisting of Schoch, geophysicist Thomas de Becky, and John Anthony West carried out seismic work around the Sphinx using seismic refraction, refraction tomography, and seismic reflection. According to PBS's summary of the later debate, the investigators interpreted their data as indicating shallower subsurface weathering toward the back and deeper weathering toward the front, which they took as support for the idea that the front portion of the monument had a longer exposure history. That is a crucial detail because it shows how the hypothesis widened from "these walls look unusual" to "even the subsurface weathering seems to tell a story of different ages or different durations of exposure." Once a controversy starts producing not only visual arguments but instrument-based ones, it becomes much harder to dismiss it as a mood. At the same time, that same seismic line of support also shows why the debate never resolved cleanly in Schoch's favour. PBS's summary notes that after de Becky Earth Sciences conducted further work for the Shaw Foundation, the investigators concluded that they found no evidence to support the contention that the weathering had occurred during an ancient period of higher rainfall in the region. Lena's response there is actually useful in a calm sort of way, because it reminds everyone that remote sensing never gives immediate truth. It gives anomalies, patterns, and data that still have to be interpreted. So even within the technical work surrounding the early controversy, support and skepticism began arriving almost at the same time. Schoch reopened the question, yes, but he also triggered the process by which parts of his own supporting framework were tested, revised, or resisted. There is something almost textbook about that sequence. A hypothesis enters with force because it explains an existing puzzle in a fresh way. It gains public attention because the implications are large and the visual evidence is compelling. Then the supporting evidence gets pushed harder than before, and some of it weakens, some of it survives, and some of it changes shape under pressure. That is not failure. That is what actual controversy looks like when it is not just people shouting on television. The very fact that later seismic interpretation pulled away from the stronger rainfall claim does not erase Schoch's role. If anything, it defines it more clearly. He was the person who took an old intuition, translated it into geology, and forced the site to be argued over with new seriousness. It also helped that Schoch's claim arrived in a moment when public fascination with ancient Egypt was already extremely high. The New Yorker describes how, by the 1990s, the Sphinx had become entangled with everything from restoration crises to New Age speculation, and it notes that in 1992 Schoch's announcement that weathering patterns required a much earlier date added academic fuel to a fire that popular culture was already happy to fan. That is part of the reason his intervention had such reach. If he had made the same argument about an obscure limestone wall at a less famous site, the paper might have remained a paper. But this was the Sphinx, and the Sphinx lives under a kind of global spotlight. Any serious challenge to its date becomes instantly larger than the normal life of scholarly dispute. Still, it would be unfair to turn Schoch into a purely media-made figure. Whatever one thinks of his conclusions, he clearly did not only wave his hands at the monument and call it ancient. He gave reasons. He described specific weathering patterns, especially the rounded and undulating surfaces of the enclosure. He tied those patterns to a wetter climatic phase. He framed his chronology in relation to the end of substantial post-glacial rainfall. He presented at a major scientific meeting published in print and continued defending the case in subsequent discussions. Even critics such as Gowrie, Harrell, Lehner and Reeder had to engage with the geology because Schoch had put the geology too squarely on the table to ignore. Reeder's later review makes this plain simply by the amount of space it gives to reconstructing Schoch's reasoning before disagreeing with parts of it. Nobody writes that much about a claim that never mattered. There is also a subtle reason his argument endured. It did not require the audience to accept every exotic idea floating around Giza in the 1990s. A person could reject Atlantis, reject the Hall of Records, reject every dramatic television voiceover, and still think Schoch had raised a fair geological problem. That separation mattered enormously. It allowed the older Sphinx question to survive even among people who were sceptical of most alternative history. The logic was simple enough to travel on its own. If the weathering really requires older rainfall, then the date must move. That one sentence carried the whole controversy farther than many more elaborate theories ever could. At the same time, Schoch also ran into the problem that follows almost every challenge to established chronology. A monument cannot be aged only by what seems plausible in geology if its archaeological context appears to say something else. Reader states this plainly. The early date provoked immediate objections because there was no archaeological evidence to support such an old Sphinx. Era's later work would reinforce the case that the Sphinx, its enclosure, and the Sphinx temple are bound into a 4th dynasty quarrying and construction sequence. That does not automatically prove Schoch wrong on every geological detail, but it does explain why the reaction was so strong. He was not merely asking Egyptologists to tweak a date, he was asking them to choose between a geological reading of the weathering and a broader archaeological reading of the site. That is not the kind of disagreement that ends over coffee. So when we say Robert Schoch reopened the question, that is not just a polite way of saying he became famous for an argument. It means he changed the level at which the Sphinx could be discussed. Before him, the older Sphinx idea could more easily be treated as suggestive speculation. After him, it had to be confronted as a geological claim made in scientific venues, published in recognisable form, and serious enough to require public rebuttal from archaeologists and Egyptologists who knew very well what was at stake. He did not settle the mystery. He made it harder to wave away, and that is often the real power of one disruptive expert. Not that he proves the impossible, but that he makes the comfortable story work much harder than it had to before. Which leaves us exactly where the argument became most stubborn. Schoch had put rainfall weathering back on the map. He had attached it to dates that pushed the monument beyond the ordinary dynastic frame. He had widened the discussion with seismic work, public presentations and print publication. But the response came fast, and it came from people who knew the archaeology of Giza just as closely as he knew the behaviour of weathered limestone. That is where the debate hardens, because once a geologist has thrown the question back open, the next voice we have to hear is the mainstream one, the Egyptological answer that says the Sphinx is still later, still dynastic, and still far less willing to abandon Khafra than Schoch ever was. By the time the water erosion argument had gathered public attention, Egyptologists were not being asked to respond to a vague feeling anymore. They were being asked to answer a pointed claim. If the Sphinx enclosure really records prolonged heavy rainfall, then how can the monument still belong to the age of Khafra and the 4th dynasty? The mainstream answer, put simply, is that the Sphinx is dated not by one clue, but by a whole cluster of connected evidence, and that cluster still points to a later Old Kingdom context. Most scholars continue to place the Sphinx in the 4th dynasty, usually associating it with Khafre, even though some debate remains about whether Khafre-Yufu or Djedefre is the likeliest specific king. What matters here is that the mainstream view is not, we like the old date because it is familiar. It is, the Sphinx makes the most sense when read inside the archaeological system of Giza, not outside it. That distinction is important, because people often imagine the conventional date rests on one brittle idea, as if Egyptologists simply looked at the Sphinx, looked at Khafra's pyramid nearby, shrugged, and decided the matter felt tidy enough. In reality, the mainstream case is cumulative. It brings together the position of the Sphinx in relation to Khafra's causeway and temples, the geological match between stone cut from the Sphinx ditch and stone used in the Sphinx temple, the shared terrace and architectural similarities between the Sphinx temple and Khafra's valley temple, and the construction sequence inferred from unfinished quarry edges and abandoned blocks. Era's synthesis states this very directly. The south side of the Sphinx quarry is the north side of Khafra's causeway foundation, which means the causeway came first. The Sphinx temple was built after the valley temple, and the lower parts of the Sphinx and its enclosure were therefore carved later than Khafra's pyramid, pyramid temple, causeway, and valley temple. That is not one clue. That is a chain. And chains matter more than single impressions. This is one reason mainstream scholars remain so resistant to arguments based mainly on the look of the weathering. From their perspective, the erosion question is real, but it is only one category of evidence. The site itself, they argue, already tells a coherent construction story. The Sphinx temple sits on the same prepared terrace as Khafra's valley temple, and the two temples align closely in plan and design. Era emphasises that the broad terrace appears to have been cut for the two temples as part of one programme, and that there is no archaeological evidence of earlier structures on that terrace. In the same reconstruction, the builders first completed Khafra's valley temple, then built a northern enclosure wall for it, then built the Sphinx temple incorporating part of that earlier wall, and finally abandoned work on both the Sphinx temple and the quarry before either was fully completed. For Egyptologists, that kind of sequence is hard to dismiss because it links monument, ditch, temple, causeway, and work stoppage into one readable project. The quarry evidence is especially important because it addresses a question people often miss. The Sphinx was not carved in isolation, and the ditch around it was not just empty space left over after the fun part. The ditch was itself a quarry, and the stone removed from around the Sphinx was reused. Lena's block-matching work argues that the core blocks of the Sphinx temple correspond to specific geological beds in the Sphinx body and ditch. In his reconstruction, the builders quarried down through the strata around the head and body, used stone from the head levels for much of the Khafra Valley temple, and used lower beds from the Sphinx ditch for much of the Sphinx temple. He concludes that the evidence linking Khafra and the Sphinx is stronger than the alternatives, even if not an absolute inscriptional proof. For the mainstream view, this is one of the strongest points of all. The monument and nearby temples are materially tied together by the stone itself. This is also why mainstream Egyptologists do not feel especially threatened by the fact that the Sphinx lacks a neat builder's inscription saying, in effect, Khafra made me. That absence is real, and critics of the standard date often emphasise it. But the mainstream answer is that Giza is not dated by a single label. It is dated by architectural and archaeological relationships, quarry sequences, and broader 4th Dynasty context. In fact, one of the ironies of the Sphinx debate is that the later evidence most familiar to the public, the dream stele between the pores, is not what mainstream scholars rely on to date the monument's original carving. ERA's mapping project states that the dream stele dates the oldest known restoration work to Thutmose IV, about 1,100 years after Khafra built the Sphinx, and it identifies the stele itself as a reused doorway lintel from Khafra's mortuary temple. In other words, the famous stele is evidence for New Kingdom restoration and reverence, not a clean original construction record. That point deserves lingering over for a moment, because it reveals the mainstream position at its most sensible. Egyptologists know the dream stele is later. They know it is damaged. They know its value is limited and indirect. The conventional case does not collapse without it. The same is true of the later inventory stele, which alternative theories often invoke because it presents the Sphinx as already old in Khufu's time. Mainstream scholarship generally treats that text as a much later, politically useful piece of Temple-era antiquarianism rather than reliable Old Kingdom history. So when Egyptologists defend a later date, they are not saying the late inscriptions settle the matter. They are saying the earlier building relationships do more work than the later stories. In that sense, the mainstream answer is actually more cautious than it sometimes sounds. It relies less on dramatic texts and more on site sequence. Another part of the mainstream defence is simply practical. If the Sphinx really did belong to a civilization thousands of years older than the 4th Dynasty, where is the rest of that civilization at Giza? Egyptologists do not make this point because they think ancient people were incapable of surprises. They make it because archaeology is usually stubbornly social. Large monuments do not emerge out of nowhere. They require labour organisation, quarrying systems, tool use, supporting structures, debris fields, settlement patterns, and other traces. AERA argues there is no archaeological evidence of earlier structures on the terrace shared by the Sphinx Temple and Valley Temple, and the whole Khafre sequence model depends on that absence. The mainstream view is not that an earlier phase is metaphysically impossible. It is that the site has not yielded the broader material signature one would expect if the Sphinx really belonged to a much earlier monumental tradition at Giza. This is one place where mainstream scholars think the alternative case often jumps too quickly from the erosion looks older to therefore the monument is much older. Egyptologists would usually say that the missing middle steps matter, even if some weathering began before the 4th dynasty, or even if an earlier feature on the plateau influenced where the Sphinx was carved, that would not automatically prove a fully formed prehistoric Sphinx. It might point instead to older natural fissures, earlier exposure episodes, local runoff patterns, or the recutting of already weathered bedrock into a dynastic monument. The mainstream answer therefore tends to resist dramatic all-or-nothing framing. It is less interested in asking whether the Sphinx is secretly prehistoric, and more interested in whether the total archaeological context still reads as Old Kingdom. And for most Egyptologists it does. There is also a quieter argument in the mainstream position that often gets lost in popular retellings. Even when scholars disagree over which 4th dynasty king is most closely tied to the Sphinx, they still usually remain inside the same general chronological neighbourhood. Britannica summarises the consensus clearly. Most scholars date the Sphinx to the 4th dynasty and attach it to Khafre, though some have proposed Djedefre or Khufu. That is revealing. The disagreement inside mainstream scholarship is often not dynastic versus Ice Age. It is which 4th dynasty ruler best fits the evidence. That does not make the question trivial, but it does show how far the accepted discussion remains from the older Sphinx claims. Even dissent within the mainstream typically preserves the Old Kingdom framework. The unfinished state of the Sphinx complex is another major piece of the conventional case. AERA argues that the Sphinx temple was never fully completed, that large blocks intended for higher masonry courses were abandoned, that the quarrymen never finished cutting and straightening parts of the ditch, and that the absence of Sphinx priests or priestesses in the hundreds of Old Kingdom tombs at Giza suggests the Sphinx cult may never have been fully active in the Old Kingdom. To an alternative historian, unfinished work can sound like evidence of interruption, lost knowledge, or inheritance from an older phase. To mainstream archaeologists, it sounds like the final stage of an existing royal project that ran out of time, shifted priorities, or remained incomplete for more ordinary reasons. Again, the difference is not in whether the facts are seen, it is in how they are nested. The conventional view nests unfinished work inside Khafre's building program, not inside a vanished civilization. Mainstream scholars are also shaped by long familiarity with Egyptian building culture, and that affects how they weigh probabilities. The Old Kingdom produced enormous stone monuments, highly organised labour systems, and complex mortuary landscapes. The Sphinx, however unusual, is not completely alien to that world. A giant royal lion body with a human head facing east near pyramid and temple structures does not sit outside Egyptian symbolic logic. It fits a civilization that already loved monumental kingship, solar orientation, and stone-based permanence. From that perspective, the burden of proof lies on the earlier date hypothesis, not because it is emotionally inconvenient, but because the known Old Kingdom already supplies a plausible and powerful setting for the monument. The mainstream answer, then, is conservative in the technical sense. Do not multiply unknown civilizations when a known civilization already fits much of the evidence. At this point, someone might reasonably ask whether Egyptologists are simply discounting geology in favour of archaeology. The mainstream answer would be that they are not ignoring geology at all. They are denying that the geology is uniquely diagnostic of extreme antiquity. Earlier in the debate, critics such as K. Lalgowri and others argued that variable limestone quality, salt weathering, and arid environment processes could produce rounded and recessed forms without requiring a massive redating of the monument. AERA's own restoration work underscores how friable the native stone is and how constantly it continues to deteriorate. So from the mainstream perspective, the enclosure weathering is serious but not decisive. It must be interpreted alongside poor stone quality, long-term damage, repeated burial, restoration history, and the clear architectural sequence around the monument. In short, they do not deny the marks. They deny that the marks can overrule the rest of the site by themselves. There is a philosophical difference hidden inside that response. Alternative arguments often treat the Sphinx as a riddle whose answer lies in one decisive clue: the wall profiles, the body proportions, the weathering, the head, the seismic anomaly, the absence of an inscription. Mainstream Egyptology tends to distrust single clue revolutions. It prefers converging evidence, even when no single line is perfect. That approach can absolutely become overly cautious, and there are times in the history of scholarship when conservatism has delayed good ideas. But it also protects against the kind of excitement that seizes on one anomaly and builds a whole lost world around it before the groundwork is in place. In the case of the Sphinx, Egyptologists still defend a later date because, in their view, the known sequence at Giza explains more with fewer leaps, and this is probably the most honest way to state the mainstream answer. It is not that Egyptologists think the Sphinx is uninteresting, perfectly understood, or beyond all argument. It is that they believe the monument belongs to the broader 4th Dynasty landscape, unless and until a stronger case outweighs the accumulated archaeological ties binding it there. The causeway relationship, the shared terrace, the quarry block matches, the unfinished temple, the lack of evidence for earlier structures in that exact context, and the continued plausibility of Old Kingdom royal symbolism all keep the Sphinx anchored in a later date for most scholars. Even the famous later evidence, like the dream stele, is treated as part of the monument's biography rather than the cornerstone of its birth certificate, which is why the debate has never really been a simple fight between imagination and expertise. It is more like a clash between two different styles of reading evidence. One style says the walls look older than the accepted story and must be allowed to challenge it. The other says the site as a whole still reads as Old Kingdom, and the walls have to be explained inside that sequence unless they can force something much stronger than visual surprise. That tension has not gone away, and it leads directly into the hardest part of all, because once both sides agree that water mattered somehow, and both sides agree the stone is badly weathered, the real battle is no longer over whether the monument is mysterious. It is over which physical process did most of the shaping, and that is where rain, wind, salt, and sand all step into the same narrow space and start competing for the story. At this point in the story, it would be very convenient if one process could step forward, raise a hand and say, "It was me, I shaped the rock. You may all go home now." But the Sphinx enclosure is not that cooperative. The reason this argument has lasted so long is that rain, wind, salt, sand, humidity, and the stone's own internal weaknesses all seem to have participated in some way. The real dispute is not whether only one of them ever mattered. It is which of them did the most important work when they did it, and whether the visible damage we see today is mostly the residue of a wetter prehistoric climate, or the cumulative result of a far messier combination of desert and near-desert processes acting on fragile limestone over a long time. Rain is the most dramatic suspect, so it gets introduced first and usually in a very confident tone. Shock's position, and later Reader's more targeted runoff argument, both rely on the idea that parts of the enclosure were shaped by water, moving over exposed rock in ways that left broad, rounded, sub-vertical forms. Reader is especially careful to say that the present degraded state of the enclosure is likely the result of multiple agents. But he still argues that episodic rainfall runoff was an important one, especially where runoff would have removed weathered surface mantles and renewed the exposure of more soluble material beneath. In that model, rain matters not because every surface was drenched uniformly, but because flowing water periodically hit certain faces hard enough to keep the weathering process active and deepen the contrast between more and less exposed areas. That is a subtler idea than the popular version, which often sounds as though the whole case rests on ancient Egypt once having a rainy season that simply carved the monument like a garden wall. Reader's argument is more hydrological than cinematic. He focuses on localized runoff, plateau catchment, and the way exposed limestone behaves when soluble components are repeatedly leached away and fresh material is brought to the surface. That is why supporters of the water weathering case often insist that critics are attacking a simplified version of the theory. They are not always saying endless heavy rain fell evenly across every visible face. They are often saying that water moving across and down selected surfaces did enough recurring damage to leave a visible signature that ordinary desert weathering alone struggles to explain. But then wind enters the discussion, and wind is difficult to dismiss because Giza is not exactly a calm indoor archive. The environmental monitoring around the Sphinx recorded wind speeds that could be substantial, and the Getty EAO monitoring report explicitly states that wind erosion is one of the contributing factors requiring study alongside temperature, humidity, and possible groundwater effects. More important than wind alone is what wind carries. The same report found that exposed limestone samples developed powdery gypsum-rich crusts and smaller amounts of halite, with the morphology suggesting that wind-blown dust was the most likely source of at least some of that crust. So even if wind is not the grand sculptor imagined in the simplest old textbook picture of sandblasting made the desert monument, it still plays an active role by abrading surfaces, moving sand, and delivering soluble material that becomes destructive later. This is where the public imagination often gets misled. People hear wind and sand and picture a clean, horizontal scouring process that ought to leave obvious sharp bands like a machine sanding a wall. When the enclosure does not look like that simple picture, they assume wind can be eliminated. But actual desert weathering is not so polite. Wind does not act alone. Sand cover changes with time, surfaces are buried and re-exposed, and transported dust can alter the chemistry of the stone as well as its texture. So even critics of the rainfall theory are not usually saying, ignore water, wind did everything. They are more likely saying that a dry environment can still produce complicated damage through salt activation, aeolian transport, and variable exposure. In other words, wind may not need to carve every groove directly if it helps deliver the materials and conditions that let other processes do the deeper damage. Then salt arrives, and this is where the argument becomes much less visually satisfying and much more persuasive. Salt is not cinematic. Salt does not make a grand entrance. Salt simply enters the pores of limestone, dissolves, recrystallizes, expands, and patiently ruins things from near the surface outward. The Getty EAO monitoring program concluded that frequent high relative humidity around the Sphinx is potentially a key factor in the deterioration of the rock because moisture absorption activates soluble salts on a nearly daily basis. Their further comments are even more direct. Weathering at the Sphinx follows the geological stratification of the rock, is characterized by spalling, chipping, and sanding, and is mainly due to gypsum and sodium chloride present in the rock and deposited from the surroundings, with the salts activated by water from humidity, rain, and possibly groundwater. That is a very serious challenge to any explanation that relies too heavily on ancient rainfall alone. If humidity can activate salts nearly daily, then rock can deteriorate even without a vanished wet climate doing all the work. The conservation literature on the Sphinx is remarkably blunt about this. Warby's restoration paper says the main agent of decay in the limestone from which the Sphinx was carved is salt and gypsum crystallization at or near the outermost surface, mobilized by upward groundwater percolation and precipitation of moisture from the air. As those crystals grow, they force thin layers of rock outward until flakes separate from the surface. That is not a metaphorical process. It is mechanical destruction happening grain by grain and layer by layer. Reader, interestingly, does not deny this at all. In fact, his later response to Van der Kruijs goes out of its way to describe the salt weathering mechanism in detail. He explains how dew forms on exposed limestone at night, dissolves soluble salts, draws the solution into the stone by capillary action, and then, as daytime temperatures rise, allows crystals to precipitate within confined pore necks, causing stress-induced exfoliation. He even notes that the underside of exfoliated chips is often coated with halite and gypsum. So one of the most important things to understand in this whole debate is that salt weathering is not merely the skeptic's backup plan. Even proponents of runoff accept that chemical weathering and exfoliation have been continuously active at the Sphinx. Their disagreement with critics is about whether those processes alone can account for the strongest enclosure features, and this is where sand stops being just scenery and starts becoming an accomplice. Much of the Sphinx's history was spent at least partly buried. That matters because buried surfaces behave differently from exposed ones. Moist sand can sit against limestone, hold water longer than open air would, and act as a reservoir through which salts are mobilized. Harrell and other critics of the rainfall hypothesis have long argued that moisture in the sand covering the enclosure could have leached salts and produced much of the erosional appearance, later interpreted as evidence of great antiquity. Van der Kruijs develops a related critique by emphasizing shallow groundwater seepage and salt weathering as a model that can explain the visible morphology without requiring a radical redating of the monument. In this picture, sand is not a passive blanket. It changes how moisture moves, where it lingers, and how salts attack the stone. That buried history also helps explain why simple rain versus desert framing is so often misleading. The Sphinx did not spend 4,500 years standing cleanly in the open under one fixed environmental regime. It spent long intervals exposed, then long intervals filled with sand, then exposed again, then repaired, then exposed under modern pollution and tourism pressures, then conserved again. During buried phases, some kinds of abrasion would decrease, while moisture-related salt activity could remain highly relevant. During exposed phases, wind, temperature swings, and occasional rain could matter differently. Once you think in those alternating conditions, the enclosure starts looking less like a single experiment and more like a sequence of overlapping trials conducted under changing rules. The stone itself makes the problem worse in the most inconvenient way possible. Era's Geology overview notes that the Sphinx is cut from the lower layers of the Macadam Formation, divided into members 1, 2 and 3 after Gari's work, and that these strata are not equally durable. The hard ancient reef at the base behaves differently from the softer layers above it, and the body and enclosure include poor quality limestone that has required repeated restoration. The Getty EAO report likewise stresses that weathering follows geological stratification, with softer strata eroding much faster than harder ones. That means any explanation that ignores lithology is already in trouble. A wall can look deeply gouged, not only because the climate was extreme, but because weak beds retreat faster than strong ones, creating relief that exaggerates every other process acting on the surface. This is precisely the argument Gary and colleagues advanced against the stronger rainfall claims. Their position, summarised in the 1995 Geoarchaeology paper, is that rounded profiles can arise in the present arid environment because the limestone beds weather differently, and that some of the deep channels around the Sphinx are older karst features rather than fresh rainfall carvings from a lost humid age. This is a crucial mainstream geological objection, because it says the rock may look more mysterious than it is. If ancient fissures, variable pore systems, and softer beds already predispose the enclosure to irregular retreat, then a lot of visual drama can be generated without requiring the monument itself to be thousands of years older than the accepted chronology. Van der Cruz pushes that line of skepticism in a different direction by emphasizing seepage and salt weathering rates. In his 2006 analysis, he argues that groundwater seepage leading to increased salt weathering can explain the currently visible erosion morphology without requiring a change in the accepted chronology. He also stresses that many of the visible forms likely exploit pre-existing structural weaknesses in the rock. This matters because it changes what a groove or recess means. Instead of being a direct measurement of ancient rainfall, a feature may be the widened result of moisture following a joint, salts crystallizing, weaker beds retreating, and near-surface layers flaking away over long periods. The wall still records water in that model, but not necessarily the kind of rainfall history that forces the date backward into deep prehistory. Reader's reply to Van der Cruz is interesting because it shows how narrow the real disagreement becomes once both sides admit complexity. Reader explicitly says a single agent of degradation may never have been dominant, and that the current state of the Sphinx can only be the result of a combination of agents, some acting fairly consistently, such as chemical weathering and exfoliation, and others, such as runoff, acting episodically. That is an unusually honest sentence in a public controversy. It means the battle is not really over whether salts exist, whether humidity matters, or whether chemical weathering is real. Those things are accepted. The battle is over whether episodic runoff left a distinctive enough imprint, in a distinctive enough distribution, to force a different chronology. And that battle becomes almost philosophical when you notice how each side treats the same processes. Critics of a very old Sphinx say salt weathering plus weak limestone plus moisture plus burial plus ordinary time are enough. Supporters of older weathering models say yes, those processes are real, but they should have acted more evenly, or at least differently, than what the enclosure actually shows. Reader's criticism of groundwater-based models hinges in part on geometry and hydrology. He argues that runoff from higher parts of the plateau would later have been interrupted by 4th Dynasty quarries, and that some observed contrast between degraded and less degraded surfaces are easier to explain if the more damaged faces had a longer and more direct exposure to runoff. So even when the same ingredients are acknowledged, the disagreement survives because the recipe is still contested. There is also the question of timescale, which quietly influences everything. Wind can act constantly. Humidity-driven salt activation can happen almost daily under the right conditions, according to the monitoring program. Groundwater and capillary moisture can act repeatedly. Rainfall runoff, by contrast, may be episodic but powerful when it occurs. These are very different clocks. If you prefer the mainstream chronology, you can argue that many small damaging events over 4,500 years, amplified by poor limestone and burial history, are more than enough. If you prefer the older weathering interpretation, you argue that the strongest forms still look like the residue of a wetter regime, with later salt and desert damage overprinting but not fully creating them. The disagreement is therefore not only over processes but over tempo. What kind of clock was the enclosure following? A slow constant one, or a mixed one with important pulses from a wetter past? What makes this especially maddening is that all of the suspects have means and opportunity. Rain certainly existed in ancient and even historic Egypt, though the scale and significance are disputed. Wind unquestionably acts at Giza and moves dust and sand. Salts are directly observed and repeatedly identified as major destructive agents. Sand burial is part of the monument's documented history. Groundwater and humidity have both been treated as relevant in conservation studies. The stone is porous, stratified, and vulnerable, so nobody in this story is an innocent bystander. The difficulty is deciding which culprit left the most recognizable fingerprints on the shapes that matter most to the debate. Perhaps the simplest honest answer is that the rock was not shaped by one clean villain. It was shaped by a conspiracy. Rain may have done some of the early dramatic work, especially if the reader is correct about runoff acting on selected faces before later quarrying changed local drainage. Wind has certainly abraded and supplied dust. Salt has almost certainly done enormous ongoing damage, particularly through crystallization and exfoliation. Sand has altered burial conditions and moisture behaviour. Humidity has activated salts far more often than most casual viewers would guess. Groundwater may have contributed in ways still argued over. The reason the controversy survives is not that nobody has any explanation. It is that several explanations are partly true at once, and the remaining question is which mixture best fits the enclosure without breaking the broader archaeological story of Giza. So when people ask whether rain, wind, salt, or sand shaped the Sphinx, the frustrating answer is yes. The more difficult answer is that they did not all shape it equally, and they did not all shape it at the same time or in the same way. Some worked from the outside, some from within the pores, some only when the monument was exposed, some especially when it was buried. Some operated almost continuously, others in pulses. That is why the enclosure remains such a stubborn witness. It is recording multiple environmental histories at once, layered over fragile limestone and interrupted by restoration. And once you accept that, the next question becomes both larger and more dangerous, because if even part of the strongest weathering does belong to an earlier and wetter world, then the age of the monument starts to wobble, and with it the neat historical confidence that has kept the Sphinx seated so firmly inside one royal reign. This is the point where the whole mystery stops being a debate about grooves in limestone and becomes a debate about history itself. Because if the strongest weathering at the Sphinx really is older than the accepted Old Kingdom date, then the implications do not stay politely confined to geology. They spread outward into everything around the monument. They touch the identity of the builder, the sequence of construction on the Giza plateau, the meaning of the nearby temples, the age of the carved body, and even the larger question of what kind of human society could have made something so ambitious before the age to which it is usually assigned. That is why this question has so much force. It is not asking whether one wall got wet a long time ago. It is asking what happens to the story of Giza if the rock remembers a deeper past than the standard timeline allows. The first thing to say, and it is important, is that older erosion would not automatically mean a fully formed Sphinx was sitting there in exactly its current shape, 10,000 years ago, waiting for dynastic Egypt to wander by and admire it. That is the version the imagination jumps to because it is the most dramatic. But the actual implications are more varied than that. If the weathering is older, then at least three broad possibilities open up. One is that the Sphinx itself, in something close to its present carved form, is much older than the 4th dynasty. Another is that an earlier monument or rock-cut feature existed on the site and was later recarved into the Sphinx known from dynastic Egypt. A third is that the bedrock around the monument, including parts of the enclosure, preserves older weathering histories that were incorporated into a later carving event. Those possibilities are not equally likely in everyone's view, but they are very different from each other, and the debate often becomes confused because people slide between them too quickly. Robert Schoch's early public argument pushed towards the strongest version. As later summaries of his position explain, he believed the weathering implied substantial rainfall of a kind that ended long before the conventional date of around 2500 BCE, leading him to place the Sphinx before 5000 BCE and perhaps as early as 7000 BCE. That is a major chronological shift. It does not merely move the monument a few reigns backward inside the Old Kingdom. It moves it out of the dynastic frame entirely and into a prehistoric world. If that were right, then the usual Kafra attribution would not just be slightly off. It would be wrong in kind, not degree. But Colin Reeder's implications are different, and, in a way, even more interesting because they are narrower and therefore harder to dismiss as pure sensationalism. Reader argued that the anomalous degradation of the enclosure developed before the 4th Dynasty quarrying that later altered runoff pathways, and he concluded that the Sphinx predates the construction of Khufu's pyramid complex and associated quarrying. That does not send the monument all the way into the deep prehistoric range Schoch proposed. It still creates a serious problem for the standard chronology, but it suggests an earlier origin that could fall somewhere before Khufu, rather than necessarily thousands of years before dynastic Egypt itself. In other words, if Reader is right, the age problem might be enormous without being limitless. The monument could be earlier than Khafre, earlier than Khufu, perhaps even early dynastic, without requiring every grand lost civilization theory people like to drag in behind it. That distinction matters because it shows that older erosion does not point to one single replacement story. It creates pressure on the accepted sequence, but the size of that pressure depends on which geological reading you accept. A Schoch-style interpretation implies a monument whose origins belong to a much wetter post-glacial world. A Reader-style interpretation implies that the Sphinx may still belong to early state-level Egypt, just not to the particular royal building program that mainstream Egyptology prefers. The consequences are different. One would force us to ask who in pre-dynastic or even much earlier times could have conceived and executed such a monument. The other would still transform the history of Giza, but inside a range that archaeology might at least hope to connect to known cultural development in the Nile Valley. Even so, both versions would damage the usual Khafre-centered story in a major way. Era's archaeological reconstruction argues that the Sphinx, the ditch around it, and the Sphinx temple belong to a 4th Dynasty quarry construction sequence tied closely to Khafre's causeway, valley temple, and terrace. If the key weathering must predate that sequence, then one of two things would have to happen. Either the archaeological sequence would need radical reinterpretation, or the monument we call the Sphinx would have to be split into phases more aggressively than the mainstream currently allows. Perhaps an older carved body was reused. Perhaps an earlier cut in the bedrock was incorporated into a later royal project. Perhaps the temples used stone from a monument already present. None of those are small adjustments. They would mean the accepted coherence of the Khafre complex is less secure than it appears. This is where the head and body problem becomes more tempting. People have long noticed that the Sphinx's head looks small relative to its body. That observation alone proves nothing, because sculptural proportion can be shaped by geology, symbolism, and practical constraints. But if the erosion were older, the disproportion would become easier to read as evidence of recarving. A harder upper layer could preserve a later recut head, better than the weaker lower body preserved the earlier form. In that model, dynastic Egyptians may not have created the entire monument from scratch, so much as inherited, modified, and reinscribed an older one. That would explain why the head appears better preserved, why the body and enclosure might carry a deeper weathering history, and why the monument can feel both familiar to Egyptian kingship and oddly difficult to contain within one reign. It is a seductive idea because it offers a middle road between a totally conventional Khafre date and the notion of a perfectly intact prehistoric Sphinx. But now the implications become more demanding. If the body is older and the head was recut later, then someone before the 4th Dynasty, or perhaps even before dynastic Egypt itself, had to produce the original lion-like monument. That would require not only labour and stoneworking skill, but also a symbolic program. A giant recumbent guardian carved from bedrock is not an accidental doodle. It suggests planning, meaning, and social organisation. This is why mainstream scholars push back so hard. Archaeology usually expects major monuments to belong to broader systems, with settlements, tool assemblages, quarry traces, ritual practices and neighbouring constructions. A monument of great age without an equally persuasive surrounding culture would be possible, but it would be unusual enough to demand extraordinary evidence. That is not stubbornness for its own sake. It is the normal caution of a field that has seen many attractive theories arrive long before their supporting world ever does. Still, Older erosion would not need to prove a vanished empire overnight to remain revolutionary. Even a shift from Khafra to Khufu or from the 4th dynasty to some earlier phase of Egyptian state formation would have real consequences. The Sphinx is not a minor statue. It is one of the anchoring monuments of Giza. Move its date, and the logic of the surrounding plateau starts to move with it. The quarry blocks used in the Sphinx temple, the terrace relationships, the construction order of causeway and enclosure, and the meaning of unfinished work all become newly unstable. Archaeological sequence would not disappear, but it would have to be read differently. What is now treated as one integrated program might instead become a story of adaptation, reuse, and monumental inheritance. There is also a cultural consequence that gets less attention but may be just as important. If the Sphinx is older than the mainstream date, then the monument stops being primarily a statement of one king's power and starts becoming an act of historical appropriation. Later Egyptians may have encountered it as something already ancient, then restored it, renamed it, integrated it into solar kingship, and treated it as part of their sacred landscape. We already know that by the time of Thutmose IV, the Sphinx was an ancient monument requiring excavation and restoration. If its core were older still, that pattern would deepen. Egyptian civilization would no longer be merely the creator of the Sphinx in the accepted sense. It would also be its inheritor, curator, and interpreter. That changes the emotional texture of the monument. It becomes less like a royal commission and more like a monument with multiple civilizations in its biography. And then there is the climate question itself. If older erosion means exposure during a wetter phase, then the Sphinx becomes one of the most visually powerful surviving links between dynastic Egypt and the earlier environmental world of the Green Sahara. Instead of being only a monument in a desert, it becomes a monument that may have begun in a landscape not yet fully desert at all. That does not mean Giza was a tropical paradise with palm fronds obligingly framing every limestone block, but it would mean the earliest life of the monument belonged to a North Africa with more available water, different vegetation, and different environmental pressures than the world of the later pyramid builders. In that sense, older erosion would not only age the Sphinx, it would relocate its birth into another climate reality. This is exactly why so many larger theories gather around the debate, and also why most of them need to be handled carefully. If the erosion is older, it does not automatically prove Atlantis. Forgotten superscience, extraterrestrials, or any other emergency replacement mythology that arrives the moment a timeline becomes uncertain. It proves only that the accepted chronology might be incomplete, or that the monument may have a multi-phase history more complicated than the standard story allows. The temptation to fill that uncertainty with grand lost worlds is understandable, but uncertainty itself is not evidence for every possible explanation. In fact, one of the most interesting consequences of older erosion would be how modest the first honest conclusion might have to be. We may have to say not, "we now know who really built it," but "we now know the accepted sequence is too simple." That would still be a major historical result. There is another practical implication too. If the weathering record is older than the accepted carving date, then geology would gain unusual authority over archaeology at one of the most famous sites in the world. That would not mean archaeologists become irrelevant. It would mean the disciplines would have to renegotiate who leads the chronology, when site sequence and surface history seem to point in different directions. In many ways, this is the deepest intellectual issue beneath the Sphinx debate. Does the monument get dated primarily by its place in a built landscape, or by the environmental history recorded in its stone? If the erosion is older, then the answer cannot remain simply by context. The context itself would have to be reconsidered in light of the stone. And yet there is a final caution here, because even if the erosion is older than what remains a crucial question, older than Khafra is one thing, older than the 4th dynasty is another, older than dynastic Egypt altogether is another again. The phrase older erosion can hide enormous differences in implication. A monument recut from an early dynastic predecessor would change Egyptian history. A monument preserved from the 6th or 7th millennium BCE would change far more than Egyptian history. So whenever the discussion turns dramatic, it helps to keep the scale of the claim in view. Not every challenge to the Khafre attribution leads immediately to a prehistoric stone lion under monsoon clouds. Sometimes the first thing an anomaly means is simply that history is more layered than its neatest summary. That may be why this debate remains so persistent. The implications of older erosion are just large enough to be thrilling, and just uncertain enough to resist closure. If the weathering really belongs to a deeper past, then the Sphinx is not merely older, it is different in character. It becomes a monument whose life stretches across environmental regimes and perhaps across cultural phases, a monument later Egyptians may have adopted rather than wholly invented. If the weathering does not force that conclusion, then the mainstream story survives, but only after confronting a serious challenge from the stone itself. Either way, the age question does not leave the Sphinx untouched. Once the possibility of older erosion has been seriously entertained, the monument can no longer be seen as only a settled royal statue with some unfortunate surface damage. It becomes a site where chronology is under pressure, and that is why the next step matters so much. Because even after all these arguments, the case still refuses to close cleanly, and the mystery remains alive precisely because the evidence keeps pulling in different directions without fully releasing its grip on any of them. Some mysteries survive because nobody has looked at them carefully enough. This one survives for the opposite reason. The Sphinx debate has been examined from so many angles that the very abundance of attention has kept it alive. Archaeologists look at the monument and see a structure embedded in the logic of the Giza complex. Geologists look at the same monument and ask whether the weathering really fits that chronology. Conservators look at the stone and see an object still being actively damaged by humidity, salts, pollution, and fragile geology. Each group is asking a serious question, and none of those questions fully cancels the others. That is one big reason the argument remains unsettled. The monument is not only old, it is being read by several disciplines at once, and each discipline thinks it is protecting the most important kind of evidence. Another reason is that the mainstream case is strong, but not perfectly sealed. A ERA's reconstruction of the site links the Sphinx, its ditch, and the Sphinx temple to the broader Khafre complex through quarry block matches, terrace relationships and construction sequence. And Mark Lehner's summary even says the evidence linking Khafre and the Sphinx is stronger than the alternatives, though not absolute proof. That phrase matters. Highly probable is not the same thing as closed forever. Egyptologists can defend a 4th dynasty date with substantial confidence, but the very best mainstream presentations usually stop short of pretending that a single inscription settles the matter beyond all dispute. When experts themselves leave a little room between strong probability and perfect proof, debate has a place to breathe. The geological challenge is also strong, but again, not perfectly decisive. Colin Reeder's 2005 paper did not simply repeat the broad slogan that rainfall happened, and therefore history is wrong. He argued something more specific. Rainfall runoff by itself does not force a revision of the Sphinx to before the 4th dynasty, but the distribution of the anomalous degradation in the enclosure, especially once early 4th dynasty quarrying disrupted plateau hydrology, suggests the key weathering developed before that quarrying began. In his words, no other process had yet been identified that could fully explain both the distribution of the degradation within the enclosure and the fact that the most intense forms were otherwise generally absent from the necropolis. That is not a casual objection. It is a careful attempt to say the problem is not just water versus desert, but why the damage is where it is. And then the counter-argument arrives, equally careful, and refuses to disappear. Geert van der Cruz argued that groundwater seepage leading to increased salt weathering rates could explain the visible erosion morphology, without changing the accepted chronology, while also emphasising that surrounding Giza monuments place real, archaeological limits on how old the Sphinx can plausibly be. That is the sort of response that keeps a debate alive for years, because it does not deny that the weathering is real or striking. It says the striking weathering may still belong to a later monument if moisture, salts and pre-existing weaknesses in the rock are doing more work than the older date theories admit. So the disagreement is not between observation and blindness. It is between two competing explanations of the same observed damage. The conservation evidence makes the whole thing even harder to settle, because it proves that the Sphinx is still actively deteriorating under modern conditions. The Getty EAO monitoring program found that both temperature and relative humidity fluctuations contribute significantly to the rock's surface deterioration, that some of the gypsum on the surface comes from atmospheric pollution, and that salt activation can occur at relatively modest humidity levels, especially in mixtures. This means a viewer standing in front of the enclosure is not looking at a monument whose damage belongs cleanly to one lost climatic moment. They are looking at a monument whose surfaces have continued to change under ongoing environmental stress. That does not disprove older weathering. It simply ensures that older weathering, if present, has been overprinted by later processes so heavily that the original signal becomes much harder to isolate. Then there is the stone itself, which behaves in the most inconvenient possible way for anyone hoping for a clear answer. Aera's geology summary explains that the Sphinx is carved from the natural limestone of the Giza plateau, with member 1 at the base, most of the body in member 2, and the neck and head in member 3. Member 2 contains alternating softer and harder layers, while the harder portion of member 3 helps explain why the face has survived better than the body. That means the monument is not one consistent material, weathering under one consistent process. Different parts retreat differently because the stone itself is uneven. Once that is true, the same visible pattern can be read in more than one way. A rounded profile might be the residue of ancient runoff, or it might be weak limestone retreating under later salt and moisture attack, or both. This is one reason the debate feels so stubbornly balanced. The older Sphinx side can point to the enclosure walls and say they do not look like a simple product of desert abrasion. The mainstream side can point to the stratified limestone and say the rock was never going to weather simply in the first place. Both positions are plausible enough to survive first contact with the evidence. If one side had only drama and the other had only data, the argument would have ended long ago. Instead, both sides have data, and both sides can tell a coherent story about it. The disagreement persists because the monument is not producing nonsense. It is producing ambiguity, and ambiguity is much harder to kill than a bad theory. Burial and restoration complicate matters further. The Sphinx was repeatedly engulfed by sand, re-excavated, patched and restored across many centuries. Aera's mapping page notes that the dream stele between the pores is a reused lintel from Khafra's mortuary temple, and that parts of the masonry used in restoration came from Khafra's pyramid causeway. The same page also states that the friable native stone of the Sphinx sanctuary still erodes daily, and that major restoration campaigns were carried out in the 1980s and 1990s. A wall that has been buried, uncovered, patched, recut around and stabilised is not a simple geological witness. It is more like a witness who has lived through several wars, several moves, and a very long medical history. Perfect memory is too much to ask. That restoration history matters intellectually as much as physically. When people imagine settling the question, they often picture a clean experiment that should have been possible by now. But the Sphinx is not a clean experiment. It is a monument with a biography. Some surfaces are original bedrock, some are ancient repairs. Some are later masonry covers. Some areas have been exposed differently from others, depending on how long they stood free of sand. Some have endured modern environmental pressures that earlier observers never had to reckon with in the same way. In a place like that, the idea of one definitive visual clue becomes less convincing the longer you think about it. The monument has too many overlapping histories written into the same body of stone. The dispute also remains unsettled because archaeology and geology answer different kinds of questions, and people often treat one kind as if it should automatically overrule the other. Archaeology is very good at sequence, context, reuse, and construction relationships. Geology is very good at processes of weathering, hydrology, and material change. At the Sphinx, the archaeological sequence around the causeway, Valley Temple, Sphinx Temple, and Ditch strongly favours a 4th dynasty framework, while the geological reading of some scholars continues to suggest that parts of the visible degradation belong to an earlier exposure history. Neither discipline is obviously unqualified to speak, so instead of one field correcting a weaker one, we get a standoff in which each side believes the other is underestimating the crucial evidence. There is also no universally accepted smoking gun in either direction. The mainstream case has strong contextual evidence, but no simple original inscription from Khafra saying he built the Sphinx. The older weathering case has strong visual and geomorphological arguments, but no widely accepted archaeological horizon at Giza proving a much earlier monumental culture built or began the monument. So both sides are missing the one thing that would make the other side's life impossible. If a pristine old kingdom foundation text turned up naming the project directly, much of the debate would shrink at once. If an indisputable pre-4th dynasty construction context appeared under or around the Sphinx, with the right tools, debris and associated architecture, the older date theory would gain a different level of seriousness overnight. In the absence of either, the argument lives in the gap between strong inference and decisive proof. Oddly enough, even the critics of radical redating sometimes help keep the debate alive by conceding part of the challenge. Reader explicitly says rainfall runoff itself does not require abandoning a 4th dynasty date. That sounds at first like a concession to the mainstream, but it also means the debate becomes more subtle rather than less dangerous. Instead of asking only whether rain ever touched the Sphinx, the question becomes how much runoff mattered, when plateau quarrying changed local drainage, and why some surfaces seem more anomalously degraded than comparable areas elsewhere. Once the issue is framed that way, the mainstream cannot dismiss the weathering simply by saying, deserts are dry. It has to answer the distribution problem, and because that answer is still debated, the mystery remains alive. Public fascination plays a role too, though not in the lazy sense people sometimes mean when they blame all ancient debates on sensational television. The Sphinx is famous enough that every unresolved detail gets amplified. If the same weathering problem existed on an obscure quarry wall in a less celebrated necropolis, it might remain a specialist disagreement tucked inside conference papers. But this is the Sphinx. It sits beside the pyramids, carries a human face, and belongs to the shortlist of monuments the whole world thinks it already knows. That fame changes the atmosphere. It attracts overstatement from both directions. Some people rush to declare that history is overturned. Others rush to declare that nothing interesting exists to discuss. The result is not clarity, but noise layered over real evidence. And noise, once attached to a genuine puzzle, can make resolution feel even farther away. Then there is the uncomfortable fact that every new study tends to strengthen one side while leaving the other alive. The archaeological sequence work strengthens the Khafra-era case. The geological runoff arguments strengthen the claim that some visible degradation may predate the accepted sequence. The conservation monitoring strengthens the role of ongoing salt, humidity, and pollution damage. The geology of the formation strengthens the argument that differential weathering could exaggerate shapes without requiring a radical redating. Each line of evidence improves the picture and complicates the verdict at the same time. That is not what people want from a mystery, of course. People want the satisfying moment when one key turns and all the tumblers fall. The Sphinx offers something much more realistic, and therefore much more maddening. Better knowledge without full closure. This is why the argument refuses to dry out. Not because nobody has done the work, and not because every theory is equally good, but because the monument sits exactly at the place where evidence remains mixed. The mainstream chronology explains the surrounding complex powerfully. The geological objections remain serious enough that they cannot be shrugged off as fantasy. The stone is fragile and stratified. The weathering is real and multi-causal. The monument has been buried, restored, and re-exposed. The environmental damage is ongoing. The evidence points, but it does not point in one clean direction, with enough force to drag every specialist behind it. And so the debate survives, not as a failure of scholarship, but as a sign that some monuments really do sit in the narrow band between understood and solved. Perhaps that is why the Sphinx remains so effective as a human object as well as an archaeological one. It is not merely damaged stone. It is a monument that keeps producing a certain emotional effect even after you know the details. The more you learn, the less the easy mystery survives, but the deeper mystery remains. Not, someone hid the answer from us, at least not necessarily, but the answer may genuinely be difficult because the monument carries several histories at once. That is a more adult kind of mystery, and in some ways a more satisfying one. It allows the Sphinx to remain what it has probably always been to different generations, not a machine for delivering certainty, but a monument that forces careful people to admit where certainty runs thin. And that is the right place to pause before the final quiet thought, because once a mystery survives this much scrutiny, the question is no longer only what the stone means. It is also what we do with the fact that it may never agree to mean just one thing. By now, after spending all this time with the Sphinx, I think the most honest feeling it leaves behind is not certainty. It is respect. Not the loud kind, not the kind that insists on a grand revelation before the night is over, but a quieter kind. The respect you feel when something has survived long enough to outlast easy explanations. The Great Sphinx is still there on the Giza plateau, carved from limestone, about 73 metres long and around 20 metres high, still usually placed by most scholars in the 4th dynasty, and most often associated with Khafra, and still not entirely willing to behave like a finished argument. That may be the best place to end our time with it, because there is a temptation, especially with famous ancient mysteries, to feel that every story must close with a verdict. Either the conventional answer wins and the mystery disappears, or the alternative answer wins and history is overturned. But the world is not always that obliging. Sometimes a monument remains meaningful precisely because the evidence does not flatten into one satisfying shape. Sometimes the final honest answer is that the stone has kept more than one kind of memory, and we are still learning how to tell them apart. The Sphinx invites this kind of thought more than most monuments do. Part of that is its appearance, of course. A face matters. A giant weathered human face matters even more. People do not stand before the Sphinx and think first about stratified limestone members, capillary moisture or quarry sequences. They think usually that it looks like it knows something. That is not science. That is the ancient and stubborn human habit of reading personality into faces. But it matters because it shapes the whole emotional atmosphere of the monument. We are inclined to believe that the Sphinx remembers long before we decide what it remembers. And once that feeling takes hold, every mark on the stone starts to look less like damage and more like a record. Some of that record is fairly clear. The monument has lived a long public life. It was important in pharaonic times, long after its original creation. It suffered erosion and damage that required repair. Era's mapping work emphasises that the Sphinx has a complex history of masonry additions, and that its bedrock core was already severely eroded before some of the earliest extensive casing was added. The same work ties early restoration masonry near the chest and paws to the time of Thutmose IV's dream stele, showing that even in the New Kingdom the monument was already old enough to require care, excavation and renewed attention. That, by itself, is already worth sitting with for a moment. The Sphinx was ancient to ancient people. There were Egyptians who lived much closer to its original carving than we do, and even they encountered it as something inherited, something weathered, something worth restoring rather than merely admiring. That fact changes the mood of the monument. It stops being just one king statement frozen at the moment of completion. It becomes a long-lived object with a biography. A monument with a biography is always harder to simplify than a monument treated as a single event. And perhaps that is the real centre of the whole mystery. We often ask when the Sphinx was built as though it were one act, one date, one solved moment. But the monument in front of us is not just the result of a carving event. It is also the result of weathering, burial, restoration, re-exposure, interpretation, and survival. Even Era's archival description of the site makes this plain. The larger quarry forming the Sphinx amphitheatre, the detailed section and profile drawings of masonry restorations, the geological mapping of the site, and the concern with reading the history of the Sphinx through both its bedrock core and its later masonry, all point to a simple truth. The monument visible today is layered. It is not only original stone, it is original stone plus a long afterlife. That layered quality is what makes the erosion question so difficult and so interesting at the same time. If the Sphinx remembers rain, what exactly does that mean? Does it mean the whole monument, in something close to its present form, stood exposed in a wetter world before the desert we know had fully taken shape? Does it mean an earlier cut in the bedrock or a precursor monument was later incorporated into a dynastic project? Does it mean the enclosure walls preserve traces of a different environmental phase, while the monument itself still belongs largely to the accepted Old Kingdom context? Or does it mean that what looks like deep climatic memory is actually the result of several later processes combining on difficult limestone until they imitate a more dramatic past? These are not small differences. They are the difference between a changed detail and a changed history. And yet what is striking, at least to me, is that the Sphinx remains compelling under all of them. Even if the mainstream view is broadly right, and the monument belongs firmly within the 4th Dynasty world of Giza, the Sphinx is still not reduced to something dull. It is still an extraordinary carved mass of bedrock, tied into a huge quarry construction landscape, still carrying centuries of erosion and repair on its body. Era's reconstruction describes the Sphinx and the nearby temples as part of a massive quarry construction landscaping project, which is a wonderfully practical phrase for something so visually strange. It reminds us that the monument is not only symbolic, it is also an immense act of engineering and labour. And if the erosion really does carry an older message than the standard story allows, then the Sphinx becomes something else again. Not merely a royal monument, but a monument with a deeper environmental memory. A stone body that may have first lived under different skies, in a North Africa that held more water than the desert does now. That possibility is what gives the debate its charge. It is not only about dates, it is about whether the monument belongs fully to the world that later named, restored and framed it, or whether part of it reaches back beyond that world into something less comfortably classified. There is a reason this matters to people beyond specialists. It is not because everyone secretly wants Atlantis, although ancient mysteries do attract that sort of thing the way lamps attract moths. It matters because human beings are very sensitive to continuity. We like our timelines to behave. We like to know who made what, when they made it, and why it belongs where the textbooks place it. The Sphinx unsettles that instinct, not because it has already proven the textbooks wrong, but because it remains just unclear enough to keep the question alive. That uncertainty creates a very particular kind of fascination. It is not the thrill of a solved revelation, it is the pull of a respectable doubt. Respectable doubt is rarer than people think. There is no shortage of noisy doubt in the world. There is no shortage of people who say everything is hidden, everything is corrupt, everything official is false, and every old stone is part of a cosmic secret. That kind of doubt is actually very easy. It asks a little of the evidence. Respectable doubt is harder. It is the kind that says, I see why the mainstream case is strong, and I also see why the stone still troubles some careful observers. I see the archaeological sequence, and I see the weathering problem. I see the restoration history, and I see how it complicates every reading. I am not going to pretend the case is closed just because I would prefer it to be, and I'm not going to declare history rewritten just because the mystery is appealing. The Sphinx earns that kind of doubt. It earns it because the accepted story is substantial, not flimsy. Most scholars do still place the monument in the 4th dynasty and connect it to Khafra's reign or immediate circle. The mainstream case did not appear by accident and does not survive by inertia alone. It survives because the monument sits within the Giza context in ways that make sense, and because the archaeology around it forms a sequence that is hard to ignore. At the same time, the Sphinx also earns doubt, because the monument has not come down to us as a neat, controlled object. It has been weathered, damaged, repaired, and reread. Britannica's summary, simple as it is, notes that the body has suffered the most erosion, and that preservation efforts have been undertaken since ancient times, possibly beginning in the reign of Thutmose IV. That is not the biography of a monument whose surfaces can be read as though they were fresh. It is the biography of a monument whose body has been changing in plain sight for a very long time. Maybe that is why the Sphinx feels older than its date, whatever date you prefer. Not older in the strict chronological sense, though that is exactly what people argue about, but older in temperament. It has the feel of something that has outlived several different ways of being understood. It has been a royal image, a buried relic, a restored sacred object, an object of curiosity, a national symbol, a tourist destination, a geological problem, and an argument that keeps renewing itself. Very few monuments stay the same while surviving. Most survive by becoming many things. The Sphinx has done that with unusual success. There is also something humbling about the fact that so much debate comes down to surfaces. We tend to imagine history as texts, names, inscriptions, lists of kings, and carved declarations. The Sphinx reminds us that sometimes history is written in weathering instead, in how stone rounds off, in where fissures widen, in which layers retreat faster than others, in what had to be patched, in what was already eroded before later repairs held it together. That is a different kind of archive, more physical, less obedient, and often harder to interpret, but no less real for that. And perhaps that is why this subject works so well at night, when the world is quieter and certainty feels less urgent. In the daytime, people often want the sharp answer. Who built it? When? Why? Case closed. But at night, there is room for a better kind of honesty, the kind that admits the monument may contain more than one time at once. The carving belongs to one phase, the weathering to another, the repairs to another, the meanings to several more. The Sphinx may not be hiding a single secret. It may be preserving a stack of histories that later viewers keep trying to compress into one. If so, then the question, does the Sphinx remember rain, becomes more useful than it first appears, because the answer might be yes, but not only rain. It remembers quarrying. It remembers weakness in the limestone itself. It remembers long burial in sand. It remembers people who cleared that sand away and looked up at the same face. It remembers the first repairs, the later repairs, the masonry that tried to hold the body together. It remembers being part of a landscape of temples and pyramids and cut stone. It remembers being read as ancient by people who were themselves ancient. It remembers enough for us to argue, and not enough for us to stop. That is a frustrating answer if what you want is closure. It is a beautiful answer if what you want is a monument that still feels alive in the only way old stone can be alive. Not breathing, not speaking, not giving away its full story, but continuing to meet every generation with a slightly different challenge. One era asks what king it belongs to, another asks what climate shaped it, another asks how to keep it standing at all, another asks whether its silence means mystery or simply complexity. The Sphinx does not refuse these questions. It just refuses to answer them all in one language, and that may be why it remains such a good companion for the imagination. Not because it proves that history is false, but because it proves that history is often layered. Not because it guarantees a hidden civilization, but because it reminds us how much of the past survives in damaged form. Not because the experts know nothing, but because even real expertise sometimes arrives at the edge of a monument and has to admit that the stone is still harder to read than anyone would like. So as you let the night settle a little more, it may be enough simply to picture it there. The long body in limestone, the worn enclosure, the face rising above a damaged chest and paws that later people tried to save, the desert around it that was not always the desert we know, the arguments that gathered around its walls, the generations that restored it without settling it, the stubborn fact that a monument can be both famous and unfinished in our understanding. And with that image in mind, there is no need to force one last conclusion. The Sphinx has carried too many centuries for that. It can stay where it has always stayed, between explanation and wonder, keeping its weathered shape while the questions keep changing around it, and somewhere in that quiet space, between old stone and older weather, the mind can keep drifting a little farther outward, because once you allow that a monument might remember more than one world, it becomes easier to notice how many other ancient things may be waiting with their own unfinished memories still pressed into the surface.